Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 31 years old. This happened in the Samuel R. McKelvey National Forest, deep in the Nebraska sandhills about 20 miles south of Nensel in Cherry County. I'm telling this story because someone needs to know what really happened out there and why you should never go to that place. Never. It was late October when Jake Morrison and Brian Chen convinced me to join them for what they called a real wilderness experience. We'd been friends since college, and while Jake and Brian were the outdoorsy types, I was more of a city guy who preferred my adventures to come with room service. But they'd been planning this trip for months, talking about disconnecting from technology and getting back to nature in one of Nebraska's most remote areas. "Come on, Mike," Jake had said, his weathered hands spreading out topographical maps across the table at our favorite bar. "When's the last time you saw real stars? Not the dim flickers you get in Lincoln, but actual stars. The kind that make you feel small." Brian nodded enthusiastically, his engineer's mind already working through logistics. The McKelvey Forest is perfect. Over 116,000 acres of virtually untouched sandhills prairie. We can camp anywhere we want as long as we're within 300 feet of a road. Total freedom. I should have trusted my instincts. Something about the way Jake's eyes lit up when he talked about the isolation should have warned me. But I was going through a rough patch. Divorce papers had been finalized just 2 weeks earlier, and my friends insisted that nature would help clear my head. We left Lincoln on a Friday morning in late October, Jake's rusted Ford pickup loaded with enough gear for a week. The drive north took us through increasingly desolate country, past small towns that looked like they were slowly being reclaimed by the endless grass. As we turned off Highway 83 onto progressively smaller roads, I noticed my cell phone signal fading to nothing. "That's the point," Brian laughed when I mentioned it. "Complete digital detox." The last town we saw was Nensel, population maybe 30 people with a single gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The elderly attendant watched us with curious eyes as we filled up the truck and bought ice for our coolers. "You boys, heading into the forest?" he asked, his voice carrying a strange undertone I couldn't quite place. "Planning to camp near Steer Creek," Jake replied. "Know the area?" The old man's expression shifted, his weathered face creasing into deeper lines. "I know it. You boys be careful out there, especially after dark." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Animals get strange this time of year. Hunting season's got them all stirred up." Brian laughed it off. "Don't worry, we've got plenty of bear spray and common sense." "Bears ain't what I'd be worried about," the man muttered, but he didn't elaborate despite Jake's attempts to get him to explain. As we drove the final stretch into the forest, the landscape became increasingly surreal. The sandhills rolled away in every direction like frozen waves, covered in prairie grass that whispered constantly in the wind. Scattered groves of trees broke the monotony, their branches already mostly bare, reaching toward the gray October sky like arthritic fingers. We found our campsite about 2 hours before sunset, a small clearing near what Brian's GPS identified as Forest Road 305. It was perfect, sheltered by a grove of cottonwoods with a clear view of the surrounding hills and close enough to a small creek that we could hear water trickling over rocks. "This is it," Jake announced, jumping out of the truck and stretching his arms wide. No traffic, no neighbors, no cell towers, just us and nature. I have to admit, as we set up camp, I began to see the appeal. The silence was unlike anything I'd experienced in the city. Not the absence of sound, but a different quality of quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. The air smelled clean and sharp, with hints of dried grass and wood smoke from someone's distant fire. We had our tents up and a fire going by the time the sun touched the horizon. Brian, always the planner, had brought steaks and potatoes which we cooked over the open flame while watching the sky fade from orange to deep purple. As darkness fell, the stars Jake had promised began to appear, more brilliant than I'd ever seen them. "See?" Jake said, pointing up at the Milky Way as it became visible across the sky. "Makes you realize how small we really are." That first night passed peacefully. We told stories, drank beer, and fell asleep to the sound of wind through the grass and the distant howl of coyotes. I slept better than I had in months. It was the second day when things began to feel wrong. I woke to the sound of Brian swearing outside his tent. When I emerged, still groggy, I found him staring at his GPS device with a confused expression. "This thing has lost its mind," he said, shaking it like that might help. "Yesterday, it showed us at our exact coordinates. Now it's telling me we're 40 miles northeast of here, somewhere near Valentine." Jake emerged from his tent, his hair sticking up at odd angles. "Technology," he said dismissively. "That's why we're out here, remember? To get away from all that." But I noticed he looked unsettled, too. As we made breakfast, instant coffee and oatmeal over the camp stove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed overnight. The forest felt different somehow, as if the trees had moved closer while we slept, though of course that was impossible. It was Brian who first noticed the silence. "Where are the birds?" he asked suddenly, pausing with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Now that he mentioned it, I realized he was right. Yesterday there had been constant birdsong, meadowlarks, red-winged blackbirds, the occasional hawk circling overhead. Today, the forest was utterly quiet except for the wind. "Hunters," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Game birds are probably laying low." We decided to spend the day hiking, following what appeared to be an old cattle trail that wound up into the hills north of our campsite. The walk should have been pleasant. The weather was crisp and clear, with enough sun to take the bite out of the October air. But that strange feeling of wrongness persisted, growing stronger as we moved deeper into the sandhills. The landscape itself seemed to shift when we weren't looking directly at it. I'd fix my eyes on a distant hilltop, then look away for a moment, and when I looked back, the hill would seem to have changed shape slightly, or moved a few degrees to the left. It was subtle enough that I convinced myself I was imagining it, but unsettling nonetheless. After about 2 hours of hiking, we reached the top of a particularly tall hill that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding country. That's when Brian pulled out his phone. "Just checking our position," he said, opening his mapping app, but after a few moments his face went pale. "Guys, this is impossible." "What?" Jake and I moved to look over his shoulders. "According to this, we're not in the McKelvey Forest at all. The app says we're somewhere in South Dakota, near the Black Hills." He held up the phone, showing us the little blue dot that indicated our position. "That's over 200 miles from where we started." Jake grabbed the phone and stared at the screen. "That's completely wrong. We've been walking for 2 hours. We couldn't have gone more than 6 or 7 miles. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. "Let me see my phone." But when I checked, I found the same impossible reading. According to our GPS, we were nowhere near Nebraska. "The satellites must be confused," Brian said, but his voice lacked conviction. As an engineer, he understood technology better than Jake or me, and I could see the worry in his eyes. We decided to head back to camp, using our compass and following our own footprints when possible. But the return trip felt wrong too. Distances that had taken us 30 minutes to cover on the way out seemed to stretch on forever. The sun, which should have been overhead, appeared to be moving too quickly across the sky. When we finally reached our campsite, the shadows were already long, even though my watch insisted it was only mid-afternoon. Our tents stood exactly where we'd left them, but something about the scene made my skin crawl. The fire ring looked somehow different, older, as if it had been there for years rather than one day. "I need a drink," Jake announced, heading for his pack where he kept a bottle of whiskey. But when he reached the spot where he'd left it, his pack was gone. "That's impossible," he said, spinning in a circle. "I left it right here. tied to this tree. We searched the entire campsite, then expanded our search into the surrounding forest. Brian's expensive sleeping bag had vanished too, along with half our food supplies. But here's the thing that really got to me. The items that were missing hadn't been dragged away or scattered by animals. They were simply gone, as if they had never existed. As darkness fell, we huddled around our fire with what remained of our supplies. The night sounds that had seemed comforting the previous evening now felt ominous. The coyote howls came from different directions, sometimes seeming to circle our camp, and there were other sounds too. Branches cracking in the forest, the rustle of large bodies moving through the grass. "We should leave in the morning," I said. It was the first time any of us had voiced what we were all thinking. Jake and Brian nodded, but we all knew we'd already lost the truck keys. They'd been in Jake's missing pack. That night, sleep was fitful at best. I dozed in 15-minute intervals, waking each time to listen to the sounds outside my tent. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps walking slowly around the perimeter of our camp. Not the quick, light steps of deer or the shambling gait of cattle, but the deliberate, heavy tread of something bipedal. The steps circled us 3 times, then stopped directly outside my tent. I lay there, holding my breath, listening to what sounded like slow, deep breathing just inches from my head. The breathing went on for what felt like hours, though my watch claimed it was only 5 minutes. When morning came, we found footprints in the soft earth around our camp. Human footprints, but wrong somehow. Too large, with toes that seemed too long, and they were pressed deep into the ground as if made by something much heavier than a normal person. "We're walking out," Brian announced. "Now." None of us disagreed. We packed what little gear remained into our day packs and started walking south, following Forest Road 305 back toward civilization. But the road, which had seemed well-maintained when we drove in, was now overgrown with weeds and looked like it hadn't been used in years. After 2 hours of walking, we should have reached the main highway. Instead, we found ourselves back at our campsite, approaching it from the opposite direction. "That's impossible," Jake kept saying. "We walked in a straight line. We used the compass." But there was our camp, with the cold ashes of our fire and our 2 remaining tents. It was as if the forest had somehow folded in on itself, trapping us in a loop we couldn't escape. That's when Brian suggested we split up. "If there's some kind of magnetic anomaly affecting our compass readings," he said, his engineer's mind grasping for rational explanations, "maybe we need to try different directions. One of us is bound to find a way out." It was a terrible idea, but we were desperate and scared, and desperation makes you stupid. We agreed that if any of us found help, we'd bring it back for the others. If we weren't back by sunset, we'd return to camp and try something else. Jake volunteered to head west into the hills where we'd seen what looked like an old ranch house in the distance. Brian would go east, following what appeared to be a dried creek bed. I would continue south on the road, walking more carefully this time and marking trees to make sure I didn't somehow circle back. I can still see their faces as we said goodbye. Jake's cocky grin that didn't quite hide his fear. Brian's worried frown as he checked his compass one more time. I never saw either of them alive again. Not really alive anyway. I walked south for 3 hours, carving arrows into tree bark every few hundred yards to mark my passage. The road remained consistently overgrown, as if it hadn't been maintained in decades, but I forced myself to keep walking. Behind me, I could see my trail of marked trees stretching back into the distance, proof that I was making progress and not walking in circles. The sun was beginning to set when I finally heard the sound of an engine in the distance. I ran toward the sound, crashing through the brush and emerged onto what looked like a real road, paved with recent tire tracks and even a few pieces of litter that proved human activity. I flagged down the first vehicle I saw, a pickup truck driven by a rancher who looked at my disheveled appearance with concern. "You okay, son?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to explain about my friends, about being lost in the forest, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. The rancher, his name was Pete Kowalski, and he owned land about 10 miles from the forest boundary, drove me to the sheriff's station in Valentine. The deputy who took my statement was patient but skeptical. According to their records, no one had filed permits to camp in the McKelvey Forest that week. More importantly, when they tried to locate our campsite using the GPS coordinates I remembered, they found nothing but empty prairie. "Sometimes people get turned around out there," the deputy explained. "The sandhills can be confusing, especially for city folks. Your friends probably made it out hours ago and are looking for you." But they weren't. Search and rescue teams spent 3 days combing the forest without finding any trace of Jake, Brian, or our campsite. It was as if we had never been there at all. I gave up waiting and caught a Greyhound bus back to Lincoln, telling myself that my friends would turn up eventually with some perfectly reasonable explanation for everything that had happened. People don't just vanish into thin air, after all. There had to be a logical explanation. I was wrong. Jake turned up 4 days later, knocking on my apartment door at 2 in the morning. When I looked through the peephole, there he was. Same flannel shirt, same worn jeans, same crooked smile. I threw open the door, relief flooding through me. "Jesus, Jake, where have you been? Everyone's been looking for you. The police, search and rescue." But something was wrong. Jake stood in my doorway without moving, his smile too wide, too fixed. His eyes, which had always been warm brown, now seemed black in the dim hallway light. "Hello, Mike," he said, and his voice was exactly right except for a strange, hollow quality, as if it was coming from far away. "Can I come in?" I stepped back automatically, and Jake walked into my apartment with movements that seemed just slightly off, too fluid, like a puppet controlled by someone who wasn't quite sure how human beings moved. "Where have you been?" I asked again. "What happened to Brian? The police couldn't find any trace of you guys." Jake turned to face me, and that's when I noticed that he wasn't blinking. Not at all. He just stared at me with those black eyes and that fixed smile. "We've been waiting," he said, "waiting for you to come back." "Come back where? Jake, you're not making sense." "To the forest, to finish what we started." His smile widened even further, showing too many teeth. "Brian's waiting too. We've been so hungry, Mike. So very hungry." I backed toward my kitchen where I kept a set of knives. Every instinct I had was screaming that this wasn't really Jake, that whatever was standing in my living room had just borrowed his appearance. "You're scaring me, man. Maybe you should see a doctor. You might have a concussion, or do you know what hunger feels like, Mike?" Jake interrupted, taking a step closer. "Real hunger. The kind that gnaws at you from the inside, that makes you think about nothing else, dream about nothing else." His voice was changing now, becoming deeper, more guttural. When he opened his mouth to speak, I caught a glimpse of what looked like far too many teeth, all of them sharp. "That's what we've become, out there in the beautiful silence. The forest has such gifts for those who stay long enough to receive them. Such wonderful, terrible gifts." I grabbed the largest knife from my kitchen counter and pointed it at him. "Stay back. I'm calling the police." Jake laughed, and the sound was like wind whistling through a graveyard. "The police? They can't find us, remember? We're not really here, not the way you understand here." But I was already dialing 911 on my phone, backing toward my bedroom door. The operator answered on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency?" "There's someone in my apartment," I whispered. "Something's wrong with him. He's threatening me." "Sir, I need you to speak louder. Can you tell me your address?" I gave her my address, but when I looked back toward the living room, Jake was gone. The front door stood open, cold October air streaming through it, but there was no sign of my friend. The police arrived 20 minutes later, 2 officers who searched my apartment thoroughly and found no evidence that anyone had been there. No fingerprints on the door, no footprints in the hallway. They filed a report and suggested I might want to talk to someone about the stress I'd been under. But I know what I saw, and I know Jake, or whatever was wearing his face, was telling the truth about one thing. They were waiting for me to come back. The dreams started that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the forest, walking through the endless grass while something followed me just out of sight. In the dreams, I could hear Jake and Brian calling my name from different directions, their voices overlapping and echoing until I couldn't tell which way they were coming from. But it was their hunger I felt most clearly. A gnawing, desperate need that filled my mind until I woke up drenched in sweat, my stomach cramping as if I hadn't eaten in days. The dreams got worse each night. Soon, I was afraid to sleep at all, surviving on coffee and determination until I started hallucinating from exhaustion. I saw Jake standing on street corners watching me with those black eyes. I saw Brian in my peripheral vision, always just out of direct sight. By the end of the week, I knew I had to go back. I'm not proud of that decision. I knew it was exactly what they wanted, walking back into their trap. But the dreams were driving me insane, and the hunger, their hunger somehow transmitted through our connection, was making it impossible to function. I told myself I was going back to find answers, to understand what had really happened to my friends. But the truth was simpler and more pathetic. I was going back because they were calling me, and I no longer had the strength to resist. I drove north again on a gray November morning, taking the same route we'd taken 2 weeks earlier. But this time, the forest road was exactly where it should be, and my GPS worked perfectly. I found our old campsite without difficulty, though it looked like it had been abandoned for months rather than days. Our fire ring was still there, but filled with leaves and debris. The spots where our tents had stood were marked by rectangles of dead grass. And there, on the far side of the clearing, Jake and Brian were waiting for me. They looked exactly as they had when we'd said goodbye, except for their eyes. Both had those same black, unblinking orbs, and both wore identical smiles that never wavered. "You came back," Brian said, his voice carrying that same hollow quality I'd heard from Jake. "We knew you would." "What happened to you?" I asked, though I was no longer sure I wanted to know the answer. "We found what we were looking for," Jake replied. "The real wilderness. The hungry place that exists underneath the pretty facade of trees and grass and singing birds." They began walking toward me, their movement synchronized in a way that was deeply unnatural. I backed away, but they didn't speed up or slow down, just maintained that steady, inevitable approach. "It's beautiful here, Mike," Brian said. "Beautiful and pure. No technology, no civilization, no complicated emotions. Just the simple need and the satisfaction of feeding." "Feeding on what?" I demanded, though I was afraid I already knew. "Whatever wanders into our territory," Jake answered. "Deer, coyotes, the occasional lost hunter, but we've been saving the best for you, old friend. We've been so patient, so careful not to spoil the meat." That's when I saw what they had become. In the fading afternoon light, their faces began to shift and blur, revealing glimpses of something else underneath, something gaunt and pale, with 2 long limbs and mouths full of needle-sharp teeth. I ran. Behind me, I heard them laugh in unison, a sound like winter wind through dead trees. But they didn't pursue me immediately. They knew, as I was beginning to understand, that there was nowhere to run in this place. The forest had claimed them, and now it wanted me too. I crashed through the underbrush, following no path, just fleeing in whatever direction seemed to promise escape. But no matter which way I turned, I could hear them behind me. Not running, but walking with that same steady pace, never getting closer, but never falling behind. As darkness fell, I found myself back at our campsite. I don't know how. I'd been running away from it, but there I was, standing in the clearing where this nightmare had begun. Jake and Brian emerged from the trees on opposite sides of the clearing, herding me like wolves driving prey. In the moonlight, their true forms were more visible, elongated shadows of humanity, all sharp angles and hungry intent. "It doesn't hurt," Jake said, his voice now barely recognizable as human. "The change, I mean. You just get hungrier and hungrier until the hunger is all you are. Then the forest shows you how to feed it." "And it's such a relief," Brian added. "No more complicated thoughts, no more emotional pain. just the simple, pure need and the joy of satisfying it. They were close enough now that I could smell them, a rotten, sweetly cloying odor like meat left too long in the sun. I backed toward the remains of our fire pit, my hands fumbling in my pockets for anything that might serve as a weapon. My fingers closed around a small camping hatchet I'd forgotten I was carrying. It wasn't much, but it was something. "I'm sorry," I told them, and I meant it. Whatever they had become, they had once been my friends. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." "Don't be sorry," Jake said, reaching for me with fingers that had grown long and sharp. "Be grateful. We're going to set you free." I swung the hatchet with all my strength, catching Jake in the side of the head. The blade bit deep, and he stumbled backward with a shriek that sounded like tearing metal. Black blood poured from the wound, but he didn't fall. Instead, he turned toward me with an expression of genuine surprise, as if he'd forgotten that I might fight back. "That actually hurt," he said wonderingly, touching the gash in his skull. I hadn't remembered what pain felt like. Brian moved to flank me, but I was ready for him. I spun and drove the hatchet into his chest, feeling it crunch through ribs that seemed too brittle, too light. He looked down at the handle protruding from his torso and laughed. "You can't kill us, Mike. We're not really alive anymore. We're just hungry." But the wounds I'd given them were slowing them down, making their movements clumsy and uncertain. I pulled the hatchet free from Brian's chest and backed toward the edge of the clearing, looking for any advantage I could find. That's when I remembered the old gasoline Jake had brought for the camp stove. The container was still there, partially hidden under a pile of leaves. If I could reach it. I feinted left, then dove right, rolling toward the gas can as Jake lunged for me. His claws raked across my back, tearing through my jacket and shirt, but I managed to grab the container and spin away. "You want to feed the hunger?" I shouted, unscrewing the cap and splashing gasoline across the clearing. "Let me help you with that." I emptied the container in a wide arc, soaking the dry grass and leaves. Jake and Brian seemed confused by this tactic, approaching more cautiously as the sharp smell of gasoline filled the air. I still had the book of matches I'd used to light our campfires. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely strike one, but finally a small flame flickered to life. "This is for my friends," I said, and dropped the match. The gasoline ignited with a whoosh that singed my eyebrows and sent me stumbling backward. But the effect on Jake and Brian was immediate and dramatic. They screamed in unison as the flames engulfed them, their inhuman shrieks echoing through the forest. But they didn't burn the way normal flesh should burn. Instead, they seemed to collapse inward, folding up like paper dolls as the fire consumed whatever unnatural force had been animating them. For just a moment, in the dancing light of the flames, I saw their faces as they had been, human, confused, and finally at peace. Then they were gone, leaving only ash and the smell of sulfur. I don't remember much about getting out of the forest after that. I know I walked all night, guided by the stars, until I reached the highway just as dawn was breaking. A trucker picked me up and drove me to Valentine, where I told the sheriff's department that I'd found my friend's remains. The investigators who went back to the site found the burned clearing, but no sign of bodies or bones. They concluded that I'd suffered some kind of psychological break from the stress of losing my friends, and that the fire had been an attempt to create closure for myself. Maybe they're right. Maybe none of it really happened the way I remember. Maybe grief and guilt can create monsters that seem as real as anything else. But I know what I experienced out there in the sandhills. I know that some places in this world are hungry, and that hunger can change you if you let it. I know that my friends found something in that forest that they thought was beautiful, right up until it devoured them from the inside out. I never went camping again. I moved to Denver the following spring, as far from Nebraska as I could manage while staying in the same time zone. I got a job doing data entry for an insurance company, the kind of mindless indoor work that keeps you surrounded by other people and artificial light. But sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is dark, I dream about the sandhills. I dream about walking through the endless grass while something hungry follows just out of sight. And in those dreams, I can still hear Jake and Brian calling my name, their voices overlapping and echoing until I can't tell which direction they're coming from. They're still waiting for me out there, still hungry, still hoping I'll come back to join them in their beautiful, terrible simplicity. I won't. I can't. But some nights, when the loneliness gets too heavy and the civilized world feels too complicated and demanding, I find myself looking up directions to the Samuel R. McKelvey National Forest. Just looking. Just remembering how pure that hunger felt, how simple it would be to stop fighting and let it consume me. But then morning comes, and I remember the real faces of my friends in the moment before the fire took them. I remember their relief, their gratitude at finally being free. That's enough to keep me here in the world of electric lights and crowded streets and complicated emotions for now. But the hunger is patient. It knows I'll be back eventually. They always come back. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote Sandhills region of north-central Nebraska, about 40 miles from the nearest town of Mullen, where the rolling, grass-covered dunes stretch endlessly under an indifferent sky. I worked at Pinnacle Insurance in Omaha, processing claims in a gray cubicle that smelled perpetually of burnt coffee and desperation. The camping trip was supposed to be a team-building exercise, though none of us were particularly enthusiastic about spending a long weekend with our colleagues in the wilderness. Our supervisor, Janet Reed, had insisted that getting away from the city would strengthen our professional bonds and reinvigorate our creative problem-solving abilities. Corporate buzzwords aside, I think she just wanted an excuse to expense a weekend away from her husband. The group consisted of 5 of us: myself, Janet, Kevin King from accounting, Sarah Rodriguez from customer service, and Dennis Bell, our IT guy who spent more time playing online games than fixing our perpetually crashing computers. We'd driven out in 2 vehicles, Janet's pristine SUV and my beaten Ford pickup, loaded with enough camping gear to supply a small army. The sandhills stretched before us like a moonscape of grass, punctuated by the occasional windmill and the scattered bones of long-dead cattle. We'd chosen a spot near the headwaters of the Dismal River, about 15 miles off the main highway down a dirt road that seemed to disappear into the earth itself. The GPS had given up trying to track our location around mile marker 7, displaying only a blank gray screen where our position should have been. "This is perfect," Janet announced as we parked near a grove of stunted cottonwoods that provided the only break in the monotonous landscape. Complete isolation. No distractions. Just us and nature. The silence was oppressive. No bird songs, no insect buzz, just the whisper of wind through grass that stretched to every horizon. Even the usual sounds of civilization, distant traffic, aircraft, the hum of power lines, were absent here. It was as if we'd driven off the edge of the world. We set up camp in a rough circle, our tents forming a pathetic barrier against the vastness surrounding us. Kevin, a nervous man with thinning hair and a tendency to check his phone obsessively, kept trying to get a signal, holding his device above his head like some technological totem. "Nothing," he muttered. "Not even one bar." "That's the point," Janet said, though I noticed she'd checked her own phone at least 3 times since we'd arrived. We're disconnecting from the digital world to reconnect with each other. Sarah, a quiet woman in her late 20s who usually kept to herself at work, was crouched by the fire pit Dennis had constructed from stones we'd gathered from the riverbank. "Does anyone else think it's weird how quiet it is?" she asked. "I mean, shouldn't there be animals? Birds? Something?" Dennis looked up from arranging kindling. He was a large man, soft around the middle, with thick glasses that reflected the dying light. "Probably just the wind patterns," he said. "Or maybe we're just used to city noise." But Sarah was right. The silence wasn't natural. It pressed against us like a physical weight, broken only by the dry rustle of grass and the occasional crack from the fire as Dennis finally got it lit. The flames flickered strangely, shifting from normal orange to an unsettling blue-white that hurt to look at directly. "Did you guys use some kind of special starter?" I asked, nodding toward the fire. Dennis frowned, adjusting his glasses. "Just regular newspaper and matches." "Why?" "The color. It's—" I trailed off, realizing how stupid I would sound. The flames had returned to normal orange, dancing innocently in the growing darkness. We ate dinner from cans. Beans, soup, the kind of camping food that tastes like cardboard and preservatives. Conversation was stilted, punctuated by long silences that seemed to grow heavier as the night deepened. Janet tried to maintain her corporate enthusiasm, but even she seemed affected by the oppressive atmosphere. "So," she said, spooning lukewarm chili from a can, "tomorrow we'll do some team-building exercises. Trust falls, group problem-solving scenarios, that sort of thing." Kevin laughed, but there was no humor in it. Trust falls. Out here. What could go wrong? The darkness beyond our fire seemed alive, pressing closer with each passing minute. I found myself straining to listen, expecting to hear something, anything, that would explain the unnatural quiet. But there was nothing. Sarah was the first to notice that time seemed wrong. "My watch stopped," she said around 9 o'clock, though it felt like we'd been sitting around the fire for hours. "It just stopped at 8:15. We all checked our timepieces. Kevin's phone was dead despite showing a full charge that afternoon. Dennis's digital watch displayed only blinking zeros. Janet's expensive jewelry showed the hands frozen at different times, as if each had given up at a different moment. "Electronics malfunction out here sometimes," Janet said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Something about magnetic fields or atmospheric pressure. Since when do mechanical watches stop because of magnetic fields?" Kevin asked, his nervousness now openly displayed. Dennis was studying his dead phone, pressing buttons that produced no response. "This doesn't make sense. The battery was at 90% when we got here." I pulled out my own phone, an older model that usually held a charge for days. The screen was completely black, unresponsive to any input. When I held it up to the firelight, I could see a hairline crack across the display that definitely hadn't been there that morning. "Maybe we should head back," Sarah suggested quietly. "Absolutely not," Janet said, her corporate authoritarianism asserting itself. "We're not giving up on our team-building weekend because of some technical difficulties." But as the night wore on, the technical difficulties multiplied. Our flashlights dimmed and died one by one, despite fresh batteries. The camp stove sputtered and went out, refusing to relight. Even our battery-powered radio produced nothing but static, a low, hissing sound that seemed to carry whispered words in a language none of us recognized. We huddled closer to the fire, which had become our only source of light and the sole thing standing between us and the absolute darkness that pressed against our small circle of illumination. The flames continued to shift colors occasionally, blue, green, sometimes an unsettling purple that made our faces look corpse-like. "I need to use the bathroom," Sarah said around what we estimated to be 11 o'clock. "Take someone with you," I suggested. The words came out before I could stop them, revealing my own growing unease. "I'm a grown woman, Michael. I can pee by myself." She grabbed one of the few remaining functional flashlights and walked toward the edge of our camp. We watched her small circle of light bob away into the darkness, growing smaller until it disappeared entirely behind a low hill. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. "Sarah," Janet called out. "Sarah, where are you?" No response. Just that oppressive silence and the whisper of wind through grass. Kevin stood up, his face pale in the firelight. "We should go look for her." "She probably just got disoriented," Dennis said, but even he looked worried. "The darkness plays tricks on you out here." We called her name repeatedly, our voices swallowed by the vast emptiness around us. Janet wanted to organize a search party, but none of us were eager to leave the safety of our fire. The darkness beyond felt hungry, malevolent, as if it were waiting for us to step outside our small circle of light. Then we saw the flashlight. It appeared about 50 yards away, a small bobbing circle moving slowly through the grass. But something was wrong with the way it moved. Too rhythmic, too deliberate, like a metronome counting out an alien rhythm. "Sarah," Kevin shouted, "over here." The light paused, then began moving toward us. As it grew closer, we could make out a silhouette behind it. Definitely Sarah's height and build. But she wasn't responding to our calls, and her gait seemed somehow different. Stiffer, more mechanical. "Sarah, thank God," Janet said as the figure reached the edge of our firelight. We were starting to worry. Sarah stepped into the light and we all fell silent. She looked like Sarah. Same clothes, same brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, same general features. But her face was wrong. Not dramatically, not in any way you could easily define, but wrong nonetheless. Her eyes were too wide, unblinking, and her mouth was set in a slight smile that never wavered. She hadn't blinked once since entering the firelight. "Hi, everyone," she said, and even her voice was wrong, too flat, too measured, like someone reading lines from a script. "Sorry I was gone so long." "Are you okay?" Dennis asked. "You look pale." "I'm fine," Sarah replied, still wearing that unchanging smile. "I just got a little lost in the dark." She sat down in her previous spot, movements precise and unnatural. The flashlight in her hand was completely dead, though we'd all seen its light approaching just moments before. "Where did you go, exactly?" I asked, unable to shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. Sarah turned to look at me and I nearly gasped. Her pupils were completely dilated, black circles that reflected the firelight like polished stone. "I went to the bathroom, just like I said." "But you were gone for almost an hour." "Was I?" She tilted her head slightly, like a bird studying an insect. "Time moves differently out here." Kevin was staring at her with undisguised alarm. "Sarah, do you remember where we work?" "Of course, Pinnacle Insurance. We process claims." The words came out in the same flat monotone. "What's my last name?" Janet asked, leaning forward. Sarah's smile never flickered. "Reed. Janet Reed, from Human Resources." Technically correct, but Janet wasn't from HR. She was our supervisor in claims processing. Sarah had known this for the 3 years we'd worked together. "I think I'm going to get some sleep," Sarah announced, standing with the same mechanical precision. "It's been a long day." She walked to her tent and crawled inside without another word. Within minutes, we could hear soft, rhythmic sounds, but not quite breathing. More like the whisper of air through broken bellows. The three of us remaining sat in stunned silence, staring at Sarah's tent. The firelight flickered across its orange surface, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. "That's not Sarah," Kevin whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't be ridiculous," Janet hissed, but I could see the fear in her eyes. "She's just tired, disoriented." "Did you see her pupils?" Dennis asked. And she didn't blink, not once. "People don't just get replaced by whatever you're suggesting," Janet insisted, though her conviction was clearly wavering. But I was thinking about the unnatural silence, the stopped watches, the dead electronics, the way the fire kept changing colors, the complete absence of any wildlife in an area that should have been teeming with birds, insects, small mammals. "What if this place is wrong?" I said quietly. "What if something lives here that we don't understand?" Kevin nodded eagerly. "Like what happened to those hikers in the Pine Ridge area last year. They found their camp, but the people were just gone." "Those were just rumors," Janet said, but her voice lacked conviction. "My cousin works for the state police," Kevin continued. "He told me they found evidence of the missing hikers. Clothes, personal effects, even blood. But the DNA came back all wrong, like it wasn't quite human anymore." A sound came from Sarah's tent, a low, wet clicking, like someone rapidly snapping their fingers underwater. We all froze, straining to listen. The sound continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. "Maybe one of us should check on her," Dennis suggested, though he made no move to do so. "You check on her," Kevin shot back. I found myself staring at the tent flap, half expecting to see it unzip from the inside, but it remained motionless. The strange breathing sounds resumed, and gradually we began to relax. "Look," Janet said, trying to reassert control, "we're all tired and stressed. Sarah had a difficult evening, and now we're letting our imaginations run wild. In the morning, everything will make sense." We tried to maintain normal conversation, but our hearts weren't in it. The fire burned lower, and none of us wanted to venture beyond its protective circle to gather more wood. The darkness pressed closer, and I swear I could see shapes moving just beyond the edge of our vision. Tall, impossibly thin figures that would vanish the moment I tried to focus on them. Kevin was the next to break. "I can't take this anymore," he announced around what we estimated to be 3 in the morning. "I'm going to sleep in my car." "Kevin, don't," Janet started, but he was already walking toward his vehicle, a mid-sized sedan parked about 30 yards from our camp. We watched his flashlight bob through the darkness until he reached the car. The interior light came on as he opened the door, a small beacon of normality in the oppressive night. Then the light went out. We waited for the sound of the door closing, but it never came. Kevin's flashlight lay on the ground beside the open car door, its beam pointing uselessly into the dirt. "Kevin," Dennis called out. "Kevin, are you okay?" No response. Janet grabbed her own flashlight, one of the few still working, and started toward the car. "This is ridiculous. We need to—" The car door slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot. Then the engine started. We watched in horror as Kevin's sedan began to move, headlights cutting through the darkness as it slowly circled our camp. But something was wrong with the way it moved. Too smooth, too controlled, like it was floating rather than driving over the rough ground. "Kevin!" Janet shouted, but the car just continued its slow circuit around us. Through the windshield, we could see a silhouette in the driver's seat. It looked like Kevin, same general size and shape, but sitting too straight, too still. The face was turned toward us as the car passed, and I caught a glimpse of those same unnaturally dilated pupils reflecting the headlight glow. The car completed 3 full circuits, then headed back toward where it had been parked. The engine died, the headlights went out, and the oppressive silence returned. "We need to leave," Dennis said, his voice shaking. "Right now. We need to get out of here." "With what?" Janet asked. "Kevin has the only working vehicle, and Sarah has—" She stopped, looking toward Sarah's tent with dawning horror. "My truck," I said. "We'll take my truck." But when we reached my Ford, the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was completely dead, the headlights dim as dying embers. I popped the hood and shined Janet's flashlight inside. The battery cables had been disconnected, lying coiled in the dirt like dead snakes. "Someone sabotaged it," Dennis breathed. Janet spun around, flashlight beam sweeping across the darkness. "Kevin, Sarah, this isn't funny anymore." But even as she called their names, we could see them sitting by our dying fire. Both figures, perfectly still, facing us across the 50 yards of dark ground. They didn't respond to Janet's calls, didn't wave or acknowledge us in any way. They just sat there, motionless as statues. "Those aren't them," Dennis whispered. "Those aren't our friends." I wanted to argue, to maintain some shred of rational thought, but looking at those 2 silent figures in the dying firelight, I knew he was right. Whatever was sitting by our fire, it wasn't Kevin and Sarah. We huddled together next to my disabled truck, trying to decide what to do. Janet wanted to confront the figures, demand answers, assert some kind of control over the situation. Dennis and I just wanted to run. "Run where?" Janet asked when we suggested fleeing on foot. "We're in the middle of nowhere, 40 miles from the nearest town, and we don't even know which direction to go." She was right, of course. The sandhills stretched endlessly in every direction, and without GPS or working compasses, we'd be just as likely to walk deeper into the wilderness as toward civilization. "Besides," Janet continued, "those might really be Kevin and Sarah. Maybe they're in shock or hypothermic or—" Then why did they sabotage the truck? Dennis demanded. Janet didn't have an answer for that. The figures by the fire remained motionless for hours. As dawn approached, though the sky remained stubbornly dark, I noticed they'd positioned themselves facing different directions, like sentries watching for movement. One faced toward where we crouched by the truck, the other toward the road we'd used to reach this place. They're guarding us, I realized, making sure we can't leave. That's insane, Janet protested, but her voice lacked conviction. As the not quite dawn continued, we began to hear sounds from the darkness beyond our camp. Wet, sliding noises, like something large being dragged through the grass. Occasional snapping sounds that might have been branches breaking, or bones, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. "What the hell is out there?" Dennis asked. I was beginning to understand, pieces of half-remembered folklore clicking into place. "Wendigo," I said quietly. "What?" "It's a Native American legend, a creature that feeds on human flesh and can take the appearance of its victims. The Lakota and Cheyenne used to avoid certain areas because of them." Janet laughed, but it was the brittle sound of someone clinging to sanity. "You're suggesting we're being hunted by some mythological creature? Look around, Janet. Look at our situation. Does anything about this seem normal to you?" Before she could answer, the figures by the fire stood up in perfect unison. They began walking toward us with that same mechanical gait, moving in lockstep like synchronized marionettes. We scrambled backwards, putting the truck between us and them. The figures stopped about 20 feet away, close enough that we could see their faces clearly in the weak light. They were perfect copies of Kevin and Sarah. Every detail correct, from Kevin's nervous habit of adjusting his collar to Sarah's small scar above her left eyebrow. But their eyes were wrong. Pupils dilated to black circles, and they moved with inhuman precision. "Hello, Michael," the Sarah thing said in that flat, emotionless voice. "Hello, Janet. Hello, Dennis." "Where are our friends?" Dennis demanded, trying to sound braver than he felt. "We are your friends," the Kevin thing replied. "We've always been your friends." "Prove it," Janet said. "Tell us something only Kevin would know." The Kevin thing tilted its head, considering. Kevin is afraid of heights. Kevin has a cat named Whiskers. Kevin's mother died when he was 12, and he still keeps her picture in his wallet. All true, all things Kevin had shared during various office conversations over the years. But the delivery was wrong, factual without emotion, like a computer reading data from a file. "What happened to the real Kevin and Sarah?" I asked. Both figures smiled simultaneously, identical expressions that were somehow more terrifying than any scream. "They're safe," the Sarah thing said. "They're part of us now, just like you'll be part of us soon." Janet tried to run then, spinning away from the figures and sprinting toward the road. She made it maybe 30 yards before something erupted from the ground in front of her, a writhing mass of what looked like roots or tentacles that wrapped around her legs and pulled her down. Her screams cut through the oppressive silence as she was dragged backward toward our camp. Dennis and I started after her, but the Kevin and Sarah things moved to block us, spreading their arms wide. "Let her go," Dennis shouted. "She's going to be fine," the Sarah thing said in that same calm tone, even as Janet's screams grew more desperate. "The process is painless, most of the time." I looked past them to see Janet being pulled toward a crack in the earth that definitely hadn't been there before, a jagged opening that seemed to descend far deeper than should have been possible. Things moved in the darkness below, pale and writhing. "Janet!" I lunged forward, but the Kevin thing caught my arm with impossible strength. Its hand was cold as ice, and when I looked down I could see that the skin was wrong. Too smooth, too pale, with veins that pulsed black instead of red. Janet's screams cut off abruptly as she disappeared into the crack. The opening sealed itself with a wet, organic sound, leaving only disturbed earth to mark where it had been. "Now there are two," the Sarah thing observed. Dennis was backing away, his face white with terror. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "Reality is subjective," the Kevin thing replied. "You'll understand once you're part of us." The ground began to tremble beneath our feet. More cracks appeared, spreading outward from where Janet had vanished. Something was moving down there, something large enough to shake the earth with its passage. "Run," I told Dennis. We scattered in opposite directions, hoping to confuse our pursuers. I heard Dennis crashing through the grass to my left, but I didn't look back. The important thing was distance, getting as far from this cursed place as possible. I ran through the darkness, stumbling over hidden obstacles, grass whipping at my face and arms. Behind me, I could hear pursuit. Not footsteps, but something worse. A wet, sliding sound like a massive slug leaving its trail across the ground. The landscape around me began to change as I ran. The gentle rolling hills of the sandhills became steeper, more jagged. Rock formations appeared where none had existed before. The grass beneath my feet turned brown and brittle, then disappeared entirely, leaving only bare earth that felt spongy and wrong. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing following me was no longer wearing Kevin's face. It had shed that disguise like a discarded mask, revealing something that hurt to look at directly. Too many joints, too many angles, flesh that seemed to shift and flow like liquid. It moved with horrible grace, each movement calculated and precise. I stumbled and fell, rolling down a slope I didn't remember climbing. When I came to rest at the bottom, I found myself in a depression filled with bones. Human bones, picked clean and arranged in neat piles. Skulls stared at me with empty sockets, jaws hanging open as if frozen mid-scream. This was where the missing hikers had ended up. This was where Janet would join them, once the thing was finished with her. The creature appeared at the top of the slope, no longer bothering with human appearance. In the weak light, I could see its true form, something like a praying mantis crossed with a spider, but wrong in every fundamental way. Its limbs bent in directions that violated geometry, and its face was a shifting mass of features borrowed from its victims. "Michael," it said, and now its voice was a chorus. Kevin, Sarah, Janet, and dozens of others I didn't recognize. "You can't run forever. This is our place, our hunting ground." It began to descend, moving with liquid grace over the pile of bones. I scrambled backward looking for an escape route, but the depression was steep-sided and offered no obvious exits. "We've been here for centuries," the thing continued in its awful multi-voice. "Long before your roads, your towns, your maps, the Lakota knew us. They called us Witico, Wendigo, the hungering cold. They knew to stay away." As it spoke, I noticed something glinting among the bones. Metal, reflecting what little light penetrated this hollow. A knife, dropped by some previous victim. I lunged for it, fingers closing around the cold steel just as the creature reached me. The blade slid between what might have been ribs, if the thing's anatomy bore any resemblance to earthly creatures. Black fluid spurted from the wound, hissing where it hit the ground. The creature shrieked, not with Kevin's voice now, but with something inhuman and furious. I twisted the knife and pushed deeper, even as needle-sharp claws raked across my chest, tearing through clothing and flesh. The pain was enormous, but I held on, driving the blade up toward what I hoped was something vital. The creature staggered backward, black ichor pumping from the wound. Its borrowed features began to melt and run together, revealing something underneath that my mind refused to process completely. Too many eyes, too many mouths, flesh that moved independently of any skeleton. "You cannot kill us," it gasped with a dozen different voices. "We are eternal. We are hunger itself." But it was weakening. The black fluid continued to flow, and the creature's movements became more erratic. It stumbled against the side of the depression, claws scraping uselessly at the earth. I pulled out the knife and struck again, this time aiming for what looked like the center of its mass. The blade went deep, and the creature's shriek became a wet gurgle. It collapsed among the bones of its victims, twitching spasmodically. "This is not over," it wheezed. "We are many, You have only delayed." Then it lay still. The black ichor continued to seep from its wounds, but the awful vitality had gone out of it. I climbed out of the bone-filled depression on shaking legs, the knife still clutched in my bloody hand. The landscape around me was returning to normal, rolling grassland under a sky that was finally beginning to show hints of real dawn. I walked for hours through the sandhills, following the sun eastward. Eventually, I found the dirt road we'd used to reach our campsite. My truck was there, engine running despite the disconnected battery cables. The camp showed no signs of our presence, no tents, no fire pit, no evidence that 5 coworkers had ever existed in this place. I drove until I reached the highway, then continued driving until I found a gas station with a working phone. The state police were polite but clearly skeptical when I tried to report what had happened. A search team was dispatched to the coordinates I provided, but they found nothing. No campsite, no bodies, no depression filled with bones. Kevin King and Sarah Rodriguez were officially listed as missing persons. Janet Reed was found 3 days later, wandering along a highway 60 miles away with no memory of how she'd gotten there. She couldn't remember the camping trip, couldn't remember anything that had happened after leaving work that Friday afternoon. I tried to talk to her once, visited her in the hospital where they were keeping her for observation, but when I mentioned Kevin and Sarah, she looked at me blankly. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't know anyone by those names." The doctors said it was trauma-induced amnesia, that her memories might return eventually. But I knew better. Whatever had happened to her down in that crack, it had taken more than just time away from her. I quit my job the following Monday, sold my house, my truck, everything that tied me to Nebraska. I moved to Florida, as far from the sandhills as I could get, and found work at a small insurance office where nobody asks about my previous employment. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that multi-voice calling my name. Sometimes I wake up to find black ichor on my pillow, or catch glimpses of impossible geometries in my peripheral vision. And I know that someday, when I least expect it, the thing I wounded but didn't kill will come to finish what it started. Because it was right about one thing. It is eternal, and I only delayed the inevitable. The sandhills are still there, rolling endlessly under the Nebraska sky. And somewhere in that vast emptiness, something waits with infinite patience for the next group of unsuspecting travelers to venture too far from the safety of civilization. Don't go there. Don't trust the maps that show it as empty grassland. Don't believe the tourist brochures that call it a hidden gem of the Great Plains. Some places are empty for a reason, and some hungers can never be satisfied. My name is Brian Wright, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Wildcat Hills State Recreation Area, Nebraska 3 months ago, and I still wake up screaming. Stephen Robinson had been my best friend since high school, and Michael Williams joined our circle in college. We'd been talking about this camping trip for over a year, a guy's weekend in the most remote part of Nebraska we could find. Stephen, ever the outdoorsman, had discovered the Wildcat Hills through some obscure hiking forum. "It's like stepping into another world," he'd said, eyes gleaming with that familiar adventurous spark. "Rolling hills, massive rock formations, and hardly any people. Perfect for getting away from everything." Michael had been hesitant. He was the cautious one among us, preferring his adventures from the comfort of a video game chair. But Stephen's enthusiasm was infectious, and my own desire to escape the suffocating routine of my accounting job made the decision easy. We needed this. The drive from Omaha took us through endless stretches of farmland before the landscape began to change. As we approached the Panhandle, the flat prairie gave way to something more dramatic. The Wildcat Hills rose from the surrounding plains like ancient sentinels, their sandstone bluffs catching the late afternoon light in shades of amber and rust. "Jesus, this place is bigger than I thought," Michael muttered, gripping the passenger seat as Stephen navigated our pickup truck down increasingly narrow dirt roads. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago. leaving us to rely on Stephen's printed maps and an old Nebraska State Park guide he'd found at a garage sale. We'd planned to camp near Buzzard's Roost, a prominent rock formation that offered panoramic views of the surrounding wilderness. But as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in violent oranges and purples, Stephen took a wrong turn. The road we followed grew progressively worse until we were bouncing over deep ruts carved by spring runoff. "Are you sure this is right?" I asked, fighting car sickness as we lurched over another pothole. Stephen checked his map again, frowning. "According to this, we should hit the main trail in another mile or so. But—" He paused, studying the worn paper more closely. "Something's not adding up. These road markers don't match what's on here." That should have been our first warning. By the time we admitted we were lost, darkness was falling with the swift finality of autumn in the high plains. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an hour, and our breath was beginning to fog. Stephen finally pulled the truck over at what might generously be called a clearing, a small patch of relatively flat ground surrounded by towering cottonwoods and scattered boulders. "We'll camp here tonight," he announced with forced cheerfulness. "Figure out our bearings in the morning." Michael looked around nervously. "I don't like this, man. We're in the middle of nowhere. What if something happens?" "Nothing's going to happen," Stephen replied, already pulling gear from the truck bed. "We've got food, water, and shelter. What more do we need?" As we set up camp by the wavering beam of our flashlights, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The darkness beyond our small circle of light seemed to press in from all sides, alive and hungry. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me spin around, heart hammering. The silence was the worst part. In the city, there's always some ambient noise. Traffic, sirens, the hum of air conditioners. But here, the quiet was so absolute it felt oppressive. Even our hushed conversation seemed to be swallowed by the void around us. "Fire's ready," Stephen called out, striking a match. The tiny flame danced for a moment, then died. He tried again with the same result. On his third attempt, the match flared briefly before guttering out in what should have been still air. "Weird," he muttered, checking his lighter. It sparked, but wouldn't catch. "Michael, you got a light?" Michael's lighter produced the same result. Sparks, but no flame. We tried everything. Different positions, shielding the flame with our hands, even my emergency fire starter. Nothing would catch. It was as if the very air refused to burn. "Must be too much moisture," Stephen said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. The night was actually quite dry, with no wind to speak of. We ended up eating cold sandwiches and huddling in our sleeping bags as the temperature continued to drop. That's when we heard the first scream. It came from somewhere far off in the darkness, a sound so primal and anguished that it raised every hair on my body. Not human, but not quite animal either. It lasted for nearly 10 seconds before cutting off abruptly. "Coyote," Stephen said quickly, too quickly. "Just a coyote." But I'd heard coyotes before during my childhood visits to my grandfather's ranch. This was something else entirely. Michael had gone pale, his eyes wide as he scanned the tree line. "Maybe we should sleep in the truck," he suggested. "Don't be ridiculous," Stephen snapped, but I caught the tremor in his voice. "We're perfectly safe here." None of us slept well that first night. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. Twice I could have sworn I heard footsteps circling our campsite, but when I sat up to listen, there was only silence. Michael spent most of the night sitting upright in his sleeping bag, flashlight in hand. Morning brought relief and embarrassment in equal measure. In the bright sunlight, our fears seemed foolish. Stephen was his usual confident self, joking about city boys and their overactive imaginations as he prepared breakfast on his portable camping stove. "See? Everything looks better in daylight," he said, gesturing at the scenery around us. And it was beautiful. The morning mist rose from hidden valleys, and the sandstone formations glowed like monuments in the early light. Birds called from the trees, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the faint trickle of running water. Stephen consulted his map again, spreading it on the tailgate of the truck. "I think I know where we went wrong yesterday. If we head northwest from here, we should intersect with the main trail within a couple hours." "Thank God," Michael said. "I'm ready to get back to civilization." But when Stephen tried to start the truck, nothing happened. The engine didn't even turn over. He tried again, pumping the gas pedal. Nothing. "Battery's fine," he muttered, checking the connections. "This doesn't make sense. She was running perfectly yesterday." For the next hour, Stephen tinkered under the hood while Michael and I offered unhelpful suggestions. The engine showed no obvious problems, but it might as well have been a pile of scrap metal for all the response we got. "Could be the alternator," Stephen finally admitted. "Or maybe the starter. Either way, we're not driving out of here." Michael's face went ashen. "So what do we do?" "We hike out," Stephen said with forced optimism. "It's only about 15 miles to the nearest ranger station. We can make it in a day if we start early and push hard. But first, we needed to figure out exactly where we were." Stephen's map showed several possible locations, none of them particularly encouraging. We were either 8 miles from the nearest trail or 25, depending on which unmarked road we'd taken the night before. "I'll climb up to that ridge," Stephen said, pointing to a rocky outcrop about a quarter-mile away. "Get a better view of the terrain. You guys pack up the essential gear." Michael grabbed his arm. "Don't go alone, man. We should stick together." "It's broad daylight, and I'll be within shouting distance," Stephen replied. "Besides, someone needs to organize our supplies. We can't carry everything." I should have insisted we all go together. Should have trusted the growing knot of dread in my stomach. Instead, I watched my best friend disappear into the trees, his orange jacket a bright splash of color against the autumn foliage. He never came back. We waited 2 hours past the time he'd promised to return. Michael paced frantically while I called Stephen's name until my voice went hoarse. His cell phone went straight to voicemail. No surprise, given the lack of signal, but the silence that greeted our shouts was complete and unnatural. "We have to go look for him," Michael said for the dozenth time. "And get lost ourselves?" I replied, though my resolve was weakening. He said to wait here. Maybe he found a better route and had to go farther than expected. But even as I spoke the words, I didn't believe them. Stephen was too experienced, too careful to just wander off without word. Something had happened to him. By mid-afternoon, we couldn't wait any longer. We packed light, water, first aid kit, emergency food, and followed Stephen's path toward the ridge. His tracks were easy to follow at first, clear boot prints in the soft soil near a small creek. But as the terrain grew rockier, the trail became harder to read. "There," Michael said, pointing to a scuff mark on a boulder. "He went this way." We climbed steadily, calling Stephen's name every few minutes. The ridge was farther away than it had appeared from camp, and the afternoon sun was already beginning its slide toward the western horizon. Time seemed to move strangely here, minutes stretching like hours while chunks of time disappeared without explanation. That's when we found his jacket. It hung from a dead branch about 50 feet off the faint deer trail we'd been following. The orange fabric was torn in several places, dark stains that might have been blood scattered across the front. But it was the way it hung there that made my skin crawl, positioned deliberately like a marker or a warning. "Stephen!" Michael shouted, his voice cracking. "Stephen, where are you?" Only echoes answered, bouncing off the rock formations in a series of diminishing calls. I approached the jacket carefully, not wanting to disturb what might be evidence. Up close, the tears looked deliberate, not ragged rips from thorns or branches, but clean slashes that went completely through the fabric. "We need to get back to camp," I said. "This isn't right. Something's very wrong here." Michael nodded, his face pale and drawn. We hurried back down the slope as shadows began to lengthen around us. The familiar landscape looked different somehow, more threatening. Trees that had seemed merely old now appeared twisted and malevolent. Rock formations took on the appearance of crouching beasts. We reached our campsite just as full darkness fell, and that's when we saw him. Stephen stood at the edge of our clearing, perfectly still and silent. Even in the dim light of our flashlights, something about his posture seemed off. He faced us directly but didn't respond to our relieved calls. "Thank God," Michael breathed, running toward him. "We found your jacket, man. What happened? Are you hurt?" Stephen smiled then, a slow spreading of lips that revealed too many teeth. His eyes caught the flashlight beam and reflected it back like an animal's. "I'm fine," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Just went for a walk." Michael stopped a few feet away, finally sensing what I had felt immediately. This thing wearing Stephen's face was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. His skin had a grayish pallor, and dark veins were visible beneath the surface, but it was his eyes that terrified me most, completely black, with no trace of iris or pupil. "Stephen," I called softly, "are you okay, buddy?" His head turned toward me with a mechanical precision that made my spine crawl. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be? You've been gone for hours. We were worried sick." "Hours?" He laughed, a sound like grinding glass. It only felt like minutes. Michael took a step backward. "Dude, you're scaring me. What happened to your jacket?" "My jacket?" Stephen looked down at his bare torso as if noticing for the first time that he wasn't wearing a shirt. Scratches covered his chest and arms, some fresh and bleeding, others older and partially healed. "I must have taken it off. Got warm." The temperature was below 40 degrees. I grabbed Michael's arm and pulled him away from the thing that claimed to be our friend. "We need to leave. Now." "Leave?" Stephen's voice rose to an inhuman pitch. "But we just got here. We haven't even built a fire yet." As if summoned by his words, the pile of wood we'd gathered suddenly burst into flame. Not a normal fire, but a writhing mass of green and blue flames that cast nauseating shadows on the surrounding trees. The smoke smelled like burning hair and rotting meat. Michael whimpered beside me. "That's not Stephen. That's not fucking Stephen." The thing wearing my best friend's face tilted its head at an impossible angle. "Of course I'm Stephen. Who else would I be?" I pulled out my phone, hoping against hope for a signal. The screen flickered and died, even though the battery had been at 80% that morning. Michael's phone was completely black, as if it had never worked at all. "The truck," I whispered to Michael. "We make a run for the truck." But when we turned toward where we'd parked, nothing was there, not even tire tracks in the soft earth. It was as if the vehicle had never existed. Stephen laughed again, that horrible grinding sound. "Going somewhere?" I grabbed the heaviest flashlight from our gear and motioned for Michael to do the same. Whatever this thing was, it had done something to Stephen, possessed him, replaced him, or worse, and now it was toying with us. "Stay back," I warned, raising the flashlight like a club. "But Brian," it said in Stephen's voice, perfect now except for those dead black eyes. "We're friends, best friends. Don't you trust me?" "Where's Stephen? What did you do with Stephen?" "I am Stephen." It took a step closer, and I caught a whiff of its smell, like a deer carcass left in the sun for weeks. "I've just been improved." The fire behind it flared higher, and in the dancing light I saw its true form for just an instant. Elongated limbs covered in coarse hair, fingers that ended in yellowed claws, a face that was mostly mouth, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. Then the illusion snapped back into place, and it was Stephen again. "A Wendigo," Michael breathed beside me. "Jesus Christ, it's a Wendigo." The thing's smile widened. Such an ugly word. I prefer to think of myself as evolved. According to the legends I'd heard growing up, Wendigos were cannibalistic spirits that possessed people who resorted to eating human flesh. They were creatures of eternal hunger, never satisfied no matter how much they consumed, and they were supposed to be found in the northern forests of Canada and Minnesota, not the plains of Nebraska. "This is impossible," I said. "Wendigos don't exist here. They're northern creatures." Geography is so limiting, it replied, especially when you're very, very hungry. Michael broke first. He turned and ran into the woods, crashing through the underbrush like a panicked animal. The Stephen thing watched him go with amusement. "Want to play hide and seek?" it asked me. "I do, so love games." Then it was gone, vanishing into the darkness with impossible speed. I heard Michael scream once, a sound of pure terror that cut off abruptly. Then silence. I was alone. Every instinct told me to run, but I forced myself to think. The thing had been playing with us, savoring our fear. It could have killed us both immediately if it wanted to. That meant it had weaknesses, limitations, maybe rules it had to follow. The fire was still burning with those unnatural green flames. I approached it carefully, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. Iron was supposed to hurt supernatural creatures, according to folklore. I found Michael's camp knife in his abandoned pack and gripped it tightly. That's when I heard the singing. It was Michael's voice, floating through the trees from somewhere to the north. He was singing "Happy Birthday," the same stupid song he always sang when he was nervous. But there was something wrong with his voice. A wet, gurgling quality that made my skin crawl. I followed the sound, moving as quietly as possible. The knife felt small and inadequate in my hand, but it was better than nothing. Michael's voice grew louder as I approached, though the words became increasingly distorted. I found him in a small clearing about 100 yards from camp. He sat with his back against a tree, still singing, though blood poured from his mouth with each word. His eyes were gone, not closed, but simply absent, leaving dark holes in his skull. Deep gouges covered his arms and chest, and I could see white bone through the larger wounds. But he was still alive, still singing. "Michael," I whispered, his ruined face turned toward my voice. "Brian, is that you? I can't see. Something's wrong with my eyes." "I'm here, buddy. I'm going to get you out of this." "It's still here," he said, blood bubbling from his lips. It's been eating me, a little at a time. It says I taste better when I'm scared." That's when I noticed Stephen crouched in the shadows behind Michael's tree. But not the thing wearing Stephen's face. This was my real friend, or what was left of him. His body was a ruin of claw marks and bite wounds. One arm was missing entirely, and his stomach had been opened, intestines spilling onto the forest floor. But he was moving, crawling toward me with desperate, jerky motions. "Help. Me," he gasped through a throat that had been torn open. Still alive. The thing wearing Stephen's face emerged from behind another tree, clapping slowly. "Wonderful performance, don't you think? I've been keeping them fresh. The meat spoils so quickly once the heart stops." I raised the knife, though my hand shook so badly I could barely hold it. "Let them go." "But I'm so very hungry," it said. "And you humans are so deliciously complex. All those beautiful emotions, fear, pain, despair, they make the meat so much more flavorful." The real Stephen had dragged himself close enough to grab my ankle with his remaining hand. His touch was ice cold. "Run," he whispered. "Don't let it take you too." The Wendigo laughed and kicked Stephen aside like a piece of trash. My best friend's broken body hit a tree with a wet thud and lay still. I snapped. All the fear and revulsion boiled over into pure rage. I lunged at the creature, driving the knife toward its chest. The blade sank deep, and black ichor spurted from the wound. The thing screamed, a sound like tearing metal, and its disguise finally dropped completely. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in matted gray fur. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, ending in claws like ivory daggers. The head was vaguely wolf-like but wrong in every proportion. Too many teeth, eyes like burning coals, ears that twitched independently. The smell of decay rolled off it in waves. But the knife wound was already healing. I watched in horror as the flesh knitted itself back together. "Iron hurts," it admitted, "but it won't kill me. Nothing can kill me. I am hunger itself. It backhanded me casually, sending me flying into a tree. Pain exploded through my ribs, and I tasted blood. The Wendigo approached slowly, savoring my helplessness. "I think I'll start with your eyes," it said thoughtfully. "Humans scream so wonderfully when they can't see what's happening to them." Michael chose that moment to attack. Despite his horrific injuries, he launched himself at the creature's legs, wrapping his arms around them. His broken teeth found purchase in the Wendigo's thigh, and he bit down with everything he had left. The monster howled and clawed at him, but Michael held on. "Run!" he screamed around a mouthful of putrid flesh. "Fucking run!" I ran. I crashed through the forest like a madman, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear the Wendigo finishing what it had started with Michael. His screams echoed through the trees for an eternity before finally cutting off. I don't know how long I ran. Time moved strangely in those woods, stretching and compressing without pattern. The darkness seemed to follow me, reaching out with shadowy tendrils that tried to drag me back. But some primal survival instinct kept my legs moving long after exhaustion should have dropped me. When I finally stopped, I was standing on the edge of a paved road. Real asphalt with yellow lines and everything. In the distance, I could see the glow of electric lights. Civilization. I stumbled toward those lights, glancing back only once. The forest stood silent and still, showing no sign of the horrors it contained. But I could feel the Wendigo watching me from among the trees, patient and hungry, waiting for my return. The lights belonged to a truck stop on Highway 71. The elderly clerk took one look at my torn clothes and bloody face and called the police. I tried to tell them about Stephen and Michael, about the creature that had taken them, but the words came out as incoherent babbling. They sent search teams into the Wildcat Hills, but they found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no trace that we had ever been there. Even our truck had vanished without explanation. The official report listed my friends as missing persons, presumed dead due to exposure or accident. But I know the truth. I know that something ancient and hungry still roams those hills, wearing my best friend's face and waiting for the next group of lost campers to stumble into its territory. I know because sometimes, late at night, I get text messages from Stephen's phone. Just coordinates, always the same location deep in the Wildcat Hills. It's still hungry, and it remembers me. I've moved 3 times since that night, but the messages keep finding me. My therapist says it's PTSD, that I'm sending the text to myself without realizing it. She doesn't understand that some hungers can never be satisfied, that some darkness follows you no matter how far you run. Sometimes I dream about going back. In those dreams, I'm stronger, smarter. I have better weapons, more knowledge. I save my friends and destroy the monster that took them. But then I wake up, and I remember Michael's ruined face and Stephen's broken body, and I know the truth. The Wendigo let me live for a reason. I'm not a survivor. I'm bait. It's waiting for me to bring it more friends. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Nebraska National Forest near the Pine Ridge area, where the rolling hills give way to dense woodlands that stretch for miles without a single soul in sight. I keep telling myself that what I witnessed wasn't real, that stress and exhaustion played tricks on my mind. But the scratches on my arms are real. The missing fingernail on my left hand is real, and Kevin's blood under what's left of my fingernails is definitely real. It started as a simple weekend camping trip. Sarah Rodriguez, my college roommate turned lifelong friend, had been going through a rough divorce and needed to get away from everything. Amanda Wright, her cousin and our mutual friend from work, suggested we explore some of the more remote areas of Nebraska that none of us had ever seen. Kevin King, the eternal optimist of our group, found this obscure campsite near Halsey that promised complete isolation from modern distractions. "Look at this," Kevin had said, showing us the faded website on his laptop 3 weeks before the trip. "Pine Ridge Primitive Camping Area. No facilities, no cell service, just pure wilderness. It's like stepping back in time. Amanda wrinkled her nose. No bathrooms. Kevin, I'm not squatting behind trees for 3 days. Come on, Amanda. Sarah laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from her in months. When's the last time any of us actually disconnected? No phones, no emails, no lawyers calling about asset division? That sold it for me. Sarah needed this, and honestly, so did I. My job at the insurance company had been grinding me down, 40-hour weeks turning into 60, stress eating away at my sleep. The idea of 3 days with nothing but hiking trails and campfires sounded like exactly what we all needed. We should have paid attention to the warnings. The drive out to Halsey took us through increasingly desolate terrain. The familiar cornfields and grain silos of eastern Nebraska gradually gave way to rolling hills covered in prairie grass, then finally to the dense pine forests that give the area its name. By the time we reached the turnoff for Pine Ridge, we hadn't seen another car for over an hour. "Are you sure this is right?" Amanda asked from the passenger seat, studying the hand-drawn map the ranger station had given us. "This road isn't even on GPS." Kevin, driving his beat-up Jeep, grinned in the rearview mirror. "That's the point. We're going completely off-grid. My phone died about 20 miles back." "Mine too," Sarah said, checking her device. "Must be the remoteness." I pulled out my phone and saw the same thing. Completely dead, despite showing a full charge when we'd stopped for gas an hour earlier. A small knot of unease formed in my stomach, but I pushed it down. Electronics fail. It happens. The dirt road wound deeper into the forest, narrow enough that branches scraped against the Jeep's sides with an unsettling screech. The trees here were different from what I expected. Twisted pines that seemed to lean inward, creating a canopy so thick that even though it was only 3 in the afternoon, the forest floor was shrouded in premature twilight. "There," Kevin said, pointing to a small wooden sign nearly hidden by overgrown brush. "Pine Ridge Primitive Camping Area, established 1923. We turned onto an even narrower track that barely qualified as a road. After another 10 minutes of careful driving, we reached a small clearing surrounded by ancient pines. The silence that hit us when Kevin turned off the engine was absolute. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, not even the whisper of wind through the trees. "Wow," Amanda breathed. "It's so quiet." "Peaceful," Sarah corrected, but I caught the slight tremor in her voice. We set up camp in the center of the clearing, far enough from the tree line to feel secure but close enough to the forest to gather firewood easily. The process took longer than expected. Our usual camping routine felt clumsy and unfamiliar in the oppressive silence. Every dropped tent stake, every rustle of sleeping bags seemed unnaturally loud. By the time we had everything set up, the sun had disappeared behind the tree line, plunging our campsite into deep shadow. Kevin built a fire while the rest of us prepared dinner, but the flames seemed strangely reluctant to catch. He went through almost an entire box of matches before getting a decent blaze going, and even then, the fire burned with an odd greenish tint that none of us could explain. "Must be the mineral content in the wood," Kevin said when Amanda pointed it out, but his usual confidence seemed forced. We ate in relative quiet, the silence of the forest pressing in around us like a physical weight. Every few minutes, one of us would comment on the unusual quiet or try to start a conversation, but the words felt hollow, swallowed by the darkness beyond our small circle of firelight. It was around 9 o'clock when we first heard it, a sound like branches breaking, but deliberate, rhythmic, coming from somewhere in the trees to our east. "What was that?" Amanda whispered, moving closer to the fire. We all listened intently. For a moment there was nothing but the crackle of flames. Then it came again. Snap, snap, snap. Like someone walking through the underbrush, but the intervals were too long, the steps too careful. "Probably just a deer," Kevin said, but he was already reaching for the heavy flashlight he'd brought. "Deer don't sound like that," Sarah said. She was a veterinarian, had worked with wildlife during her internship. "That's too methodical, too purposeful." The sound stopped abruptly, leaving us straining our ears in the sudden silence. Kevin switched on his flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line, but the light seemed strangely weak, barely penetrating a few feet into the darkness between the trees. "Battery must be low," he muttered, but I had seen him check it that morning. It had been fine. We stayed close to the fire for the rest of the evening, keeping the conversation light but finding ourselves constantly glancing toward the trees. The breaking branch sound didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness. Every shadow seemed to shift and move at the edge of my vision. Every small sound from the forest made me jump. When we finally decided to turn in around 11, the fire had died down to glowing embers despite Kevin's attempts to keep it blazing. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, I could have sworn I heard something moving around the perimeter of our campsite. A soft, shuffling sound, like bare feet on pine needles. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered. "Hear what?" Amanda responded, but her voice was tight with tension. "Nothing," I said. "Never mind." But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started to drift off, some small sound would jolt me awake. The rustle of fabric that didn't match anyone's breathing, the soft creak of tree branches when there was no wind, the distant sound of something that might have been sobbing. Around 3 a.m, I gave up trying to sleep and lay listening to the night sounds, or lack thereof. The silence was so complete it felt unnatural, oppressive. Even in the remotest wilderness areas there should be some ambient noise. Owls, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush. But here, there was nothing except the sound of our own breathing and the occasional pop from the dying fire. It was then that I heard Sarah gasp. "Michael," she whispered urgently. "Michael, wake up." "I'm awake," I said quietly. "What is it?" "Look at the fire." I rolled over and felt my blood turn to ice. The fire, which had been nothing but glowing coals when we'd gone to bed, was now blazing again. But the flames were wrong. Instead of the normal yellow and orange, they burned a deep, unnatural blue-green that cast eerie shadows across our campsite. "Kevin," I called softly. "Kevin, are you seeing this?" No response. I looked toward his tent and felt my stomach drop. The fabric was moving strangely, rippling as if something was moving around inside, but the motion was too fluid, too serpentine to be human. "Kevin!" Amanda's voice cracked with fear. The movement in the tent stopped abruptly. For a long moment, everything was still. Then Kevin's voice drifted out from inside the tent, but it sounded wrong. Too flat, emotionless. "I'm fine," he said, "just adjusting my sleeping bag." The three of us exchanged glances across the campsite. There was something fundamentally wrong with Kevin's voice, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. It was still recognizably him, but stripped of all the warmth and personality that made Kevin who he was. "The fire," Sarah whispered. "Why is it burning like that?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I don't like any of this." We stayed awake until dawn, watching the unnatural flames dance and listening for any sound from Kevin's tent. He didn't speak again, and the strange movement inside the tent had stopped, but somehow his silence was even more unsettling than the bizarre activity had been. When the sun finally crested the tree line, the fire immediately returned to normal, regular orange flames that quickly died down to harmless embers. Kevin emerged from his tent a few minutes later, stretching and yawning as if nothing had happened. "Morning, everyone," he said cheerfully. "Sleep well?" "Kevin," Amanda said carefully, "did you hear anything strange last night, or notice anything weird about the fire?" He looked genuinely confused. "What about the fire? I was out cold all night, slept like a baby." The three of us looked at each other, but what could we say? That we'd seen him moving strangely in his tent? That the fire had burned an impossible color? In the bright morning sunshine, it all seemed like the product of overwrought imaginations and sleep deprivation. "Never mind," Sarah said. "Probably just the wind." But I noticed she avoided looking directly at Kevin when she said it. We spent the morning hiking one of the trails that led deeper into the forest. Kevin seemed perfectly normal, chatting enthusiastically about the wildlife we spotted, pointing out interesting rock formations, making his usual terrible jokes that had us all groaning and laughing despite our unease from the night before. It was only when we were heading back to camp around noon that I realized something was off about his behavior. Kevin was an amateur photographer, never went anywhere without his camera, and usually took dozens of pictures on any hike, but I hadn't seen him pull out his camera once all morning. "Hey, Kevin," I said as we navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "Getting some good shots today?" He looked at me blankly for a moment. "Shots? Photos? With your camera? You know, the one you spent $300 on last month and wouldn't shut up about?" Another pause. Then his face cleared. "Oh, right, the camera. I forgot to bring it. Left it in the car." That was impossible. Kevin never forgot his camera. Ever. It was like asking a painter to forget their brushes or a writer to forget their pen. But when I looked back at him, he was smiling that same cheerful smile, and I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. We returned to camp for lunch, and Kevin volunteered to gather more firewood while the rest of us prepared sandwiches. He headed into the forest to our north, whistling tunelessly. Another thing Kevin never did. In all the years I'd known him, I'd never heard him whistle. "Is it just me?" Amanda said quietly once he was out of earshot. "Or is Kevin acting weird?" "It's not just you," Sarah confirmed. "Something's off about him today. He seems empty, like he's going through the motions of being Kevin without actually being Kevin." I was about to respond when we heard Kevin calling from the forest. "Hey, guys, come check this out." His voice was coming from deeper in the woods than he should have been able to travel in the few minutes he'd been gone. We looked at each other uncertainly. "Kevin," I called back, "where are you?" "Over here. You've got to see this." The voice was definitely Kevin's, but there was something wrong with the acoustics. It seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, echoing strangely through the trees. "Stay together," Sarah said quietly, and we headed into the forest following the sound of Kevin's voice. The deeper we went, the darker it became. The pine canopy here was so thick that almost no sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. Our footsteps were muffled by decades of fallen needles, and the air had a strange, sweet smell that reminded me of rotting fruit. "Kevin," Amanda called, "where are you?" "Here," came the response, but it sounded like it was coming from directly above us now. We looked up into the canopy but saw nothing except shadows and twisted branches. We kept walking, following the voice deeper into the forest. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we reached a small clearing that I was certain hadn't been on any of the trail maps. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones arranged around what looked like the remains of an old campfire. But it wasn't the stone circle that made my blood run cold. It was what was inside it. Scattered around the fire pit were bones. Lots of bones. Some were clearly animal. I could make out what looked like deer skulls and rabbit rib cages, but others were different, longer, more humanoid, and they were arranged in deliberate patterns spiraling out from the center like some kind of ritual mandala. "Jesus Christ," Amanda breathed. "What is this place?" "Kevin," Sarah called, but her voice was barely above a whisper. "Kevin, where are you?" No response this time. The forest had returned to that unnatural silence, pressing in around us like a living thing. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs as I looked around the clearing, searching for any sign of our friend. That's when I saw the tracks. Leading away from the bone circle heading deeper into the forest were footprints. Human footprints, the right size to be Kevin's hiking boots. But they were wrong somehow. Too deep, as if whoever made them was carrying an enormous weight, and spaced too far apart as if the person making them had an unnaturally long stride. "We need to get out of here," I said quietly. "Now." "But Kevin," Amanda started. "Kevin's not here," Sarah said firmly. "I don't think he ever was. That wasn't his voice." We backed away from the bone circle slowly, not wanting to turn our backs on it. As we reached the edge of the clearing, I heard something that made my skin crawl. A low, humming sound, almost like singing, coming from somewhere in the trees ahead of us. The humming was in Kevin's voice. We ran. Branches tore at our clothes and faces as we crashed through the undergrowth trying to find our way back to camp. The humming followed us, always seeming to come from just behind us, just out of sight. Every time we thought we'd lost it, it would start up again from a different direction, hurting us like prey. By the time we stumbled back into our campsite, we were scraped and bleeding from dozens of cuts. The sun was already starting to set, though it felt like we'd only been gone for an hour or two. My watch had stopped working sometime during our panicked flight through the forest. "Where's Kevin?" Amanda panted, looking around the campsite. "Did he come back?" The campsite looked exactly as we'd left it, with one exception. Kevin's tent was gone. Not collapsed or moved, but gone entirely. There was no sign it had ever been there except for a small patch of flattened grass. "This is impossible," Sarah said, staring at the empty space where Kevin's tent had been. "Tents don't just disappear." I walked over to where Kevin's tent should have been and knelt down to examine the ground. The grass was indeed flattened in a rough tent shape, but there was something else. Dark stains in the earth that looked disturbingly like blood. "We need to leave," I said, standing up quickly. "Right now. Pack everything and go." "We can't leave Kevin," Amanda protested. "What if he's hurt? What if he's lost?" "Kevin's gone," I said more harshly than I intended. Whatever that thing was in the forest, it wasn't Kevin, and whatever happened to the real Kevin? I gestured at the bloodstains. "I don't think we want to find out." We threw our gear into our packs as quickly as possible, not bothering to fold anything properly. The sun was disappearing behind the tree line, and I had no desire to spend another night in this place. As we worked, I kept glancing toward the forest, expecting to see Kevin emerge from the trees at any moment, but I knew that if something did emerge wearing Kevin's face, it wouldn't really be him. We were almost finished packing when Amanda screamed. I spun around to see her pointing at the edge of the campsite. There, standing just at the tree line, was Kevin. But something was horribly wrong with him. He was standing too still, arms hanging at his sides like a marionette with cut strings. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his mouth was stretched in a grin that was too wide, showing too many teeth. "Hello, friends," he said, and his voice was wrong too deep, with an odd echo that seemed to come from somewhere behind his teeth. "Why are you packing? The fun is just beginning." "That's not Kevin," Sarah whispered, backing away from the thing wearing our friend's face. "Of course I'm Kevin," it said, taking a step into the campsite. Its movement was wrong too fluid, like it was floating rather than walking. "Don't you recognize me? I'm your old friend Kevin King. I've been waiting for you to come back." "Waiting for how long?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We were only gone for a couple hours." The thing that looked like Kevin tilted its head to the other side, that impossible grin never wavering. "Hours? Days? Months? Time moves differently here, Michael. Don't you feel it? The way the minutes stretch and compress? The way the sun seems to set too quickly?" As it spoke, I realized it was right. Something was wrong with time in this place. Our hiking trip that morning had felt like it lasted all day, but according to my stopped watch, we'd been gone for less than an hour. And now the sun was setting when it should have been mid-afternoon. "What did you do with Kevin?" Amanda demanded, though her voice shook with terror. "I am Kevin," the thing said, its grin somehow growing even wider. "I'm just improved, enhanced. I've learned so much since I came here. Would you like me to show you?" It raised its hands, and I saw that its fingernails had grown into long, curved claws. Dark stains covered its fingers, blood that was still wet and fresh. "The bones in the circle," it continued conversationally, "they're quite old, decades of travelers who got lost in these woods. But they're not really gone, you know. They're all still here in a way. Part of the forest now. Part of me." Sarah grabbed my arm. "Run," she whispered. But as we turned toward the jeep, we saw that our escape route was blocked. Standing around our vehicle were more figures, men and women in old-fashioned camping gear, their faces bearing that same impossible grin, their eyes reflecting the dying light like animal eyes in the darkness. "You can't leave," the Kevin thing said from behind us. "No one leaves Pine Ridge. That's the rule. Once you hear the call, once you answer, you become part of the forest, part of the hunger." I looked around desperately for another option. The dirt road was blocked by the grinning figures. The forest surrounded us on all sides. We were trapped. "What do you want?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "To feed," the Kevin thing said simply. "It's been so long since we've had fresh meat. The three of you will keep us satisfied for quite some time." The other figures began moving toward us slowly, their movements just as wrong and fluid as the Kevin things. As they got closer, I could see that their old-fashioned clothes were stained with dark patches, and several of them were missing pieces. Fingers, chunks of flesh, entire limbs in some cases. "The circle," Sarah whispered urgently. "The bone circle in the forest. I think that's important somehow. That's where this all started." "What good does that do us?" Amanda hissed back. "We'll never make it back there." But I was thinking. The bone circle was clearly some kind of focal point for whatever was happening here. And if these things were connected to it... "The fire," I said suddenly. "Last night when the fire burned blue, that was when Kevin changed. The fire is connected to the circle somehow." The figures were getting closer now, close enough that I could smell them. A sickly, sweet odor of decay and something else, something hungrier and more primal. The Kevin thing was still grinning, but its eyes had gone completely black. "Very good, Michael," it said. "You're starting to understand. The fire is the gateway, the circle is the anchor, and the hunger is eternal." I grabbed a burning branch from our campfire and held it out like a weapon. The figures stopped advancing immediately, their grins faltering for the first time. "Interesting," the Kevin thing said. "You think fire will protect you? Fire is what brought me here in the first place." But I noticed it didn't come any closer, and the other figures had backed away slightly when I raised the burning branch. "Sarah, Amanda," I said quietly, "grab more fire, as much as you can carry." They understood immediately, each grabbing burning pieces of wood from our campfire. The figures backed away further, forming a loose circle around us but no longer advancing. "You can delay the inevitable," the Kevin thing said, "but you cannot escape it. The fire will burn out eventually, and when it does, we'll be waiting." "Maybe," I said, backing toward the forest path we'd taken that morning. "But not tonight." Holding our improvised torches high, we began moving toward the tree line. The figures followed us but kept their distance, their black eyes reflecting the firelight like pools of oil. The Kevin thing walked alongside us, just out of range of the flames, keeping up a steady stream of conversation. "You know, Michael, I remember when you were afraid of the dark as a child. Your mother told me about it. How you used to sleep with every light in your room on because you were convinced something was hiding in the shadows. You were right, of course. Something was hiding. Something is always hiding, waiting for the lights to go out." I tried not to listen, but its words wormed their way into my head. It did know things about me that only the real Kevin would know, personal things I'd shared during late-night conversations in college, but the voice delivering those memories was wrong, hollow, like an echo of Kevin rather than Kevin himself. We made slow progress through the forest, our torches providing just enough light to navigate by. Every few steps, one of the figures would dart forward, testing our defenses, but they always backed away when we swung our flames in their direction. "Tell me, Amanda," the Kevin thing said, switching its attention to her, "how is your sister doing? The one with the drug problem? Still stealing from your parents to feed her habit?" Amanda sobbed, nearly dropping her torch. "Shut up. Kevin promised he'd never tell anyone about that. But I am Kevin," it said with mock hurt. "And I'm just concerned about family. After all, we're all going to be family soon. One big, hungry family." I could see Amanda's resolve wavering, the personal attacks hitting their mark. Don't listen to it, I said firmly. Whatever it knows, it got from Kevin. But it's not him. Kevin would never use your pain against you like that. Wouldn't I? The thing asked with genuine curiosity. How well do you really know your friends, Michael? How well does anyone really know anyone else? Kevin had such interesting thoughts about all of you, such delicious resentments and jealousies. But I kept walking, kept the flame between us and them, and tried to remember which direction the bone circle was. If I was right about the fire being connected to the circle, then maybe destroying the circle would break whatever hold this place had on Kevin and the other trapped souls. The deeper we went into the forest, the darker it became. Our torches seemed to be burning dimmer, the flames growing smaller despite the steady supply of wood. I could feel exhaustion creeping into my limbs, and I knew we couldn't keep this up much longer. That's when we heard it. A new sound cutting through the night air. Screaming, human screaming, coming from somewhere ahead of us in the darkness. Kevin, Amanda breathed. That's Kevin, the real Kevin. The screaming continued, raw and desperate, filled with a pain so profound it made my teeth ache to hear it, and underneath it, a sound like tearing. Wet, organic sounds that I didn't want to think about too closely. He's not dead, Sarah said, her voice filled with horror. Whatever they did to him, he's still alive. The Kevin thing beside us laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh yes, he's still in there, still screaming, still begging. The consciousness never really dies, you see. It just gets absorbed, integrated. He's part of us now, but he remembers being separate. He remembers being human, and it hurts so very much. The screaming cut off abruptly, leaving only silence and the sound of our labored breathing. I felt something inside me break at that moment. Anger replacing fear, rage burning away the terror that had been paralyzing me. You bastard, I snarled, swinging my torch at the Kevin thing's face. It leaped back with inhuman speed, but not before the flames caught its cheek. The flesh sizzled and bubbled, and for a moment I saw something underneath. Something dark and writhing that definitely wasn't human. Oh, that was a mistake, it said, and its voice had changed completely now. Gone was any pretense of being Kevin. This was something else, something ancient and hungry and utterly alien. I was going to make your deaths quick, but now I think I'll take my time. The other figures closed in, no longer maintaining their distance. Fire or no fire, they were done playing games. I swung my torch in wide arcs, trying to keep them back, but there were too many of them and they were moving too fast. One of them, a woman in a tattered 1950s camping outfit, lunged at Sarah from the side. Sarah spun and caught her in the face with her torch, sending the creature stumbling backward with its hair on fire. But two more figures grabbed her from behind, their clawed hands tearing through her jacket like paper. Sarah, I shouted, trying to reach her, but Amanda grabbed my arm. The circle, she yelled over the sounds of the fight. You said the circle was important. We have to get to the circle. She was right. Fighting these things one by one was hopeless. But if the bone circle was somehow central to their power... This way, I shouted, pulling both women toward what I hoped was the right direction. We ran through the forest, branches tearing at our faces and clothes, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind us. My torch was burning lower now, the flame barely illuminating the ground at our feet. Sarah was bleeding from deep scratches on her arms where the creatures had grabbed her, and Amanda was limping from a twisted ankle. Then, suddenly, we burst into the clearing with the bone circle. It looked different at night. The bones seemed to glow with their own faint light, and the air above the circle shimmered like heat waves. At the center of the circle, where the fire pit should have been, was a hole. A perfectly round hole that seemed to descend into absolute darkness. "What is that?" Sarah whispered. Before I could answer, the creatures burst into the clearing behind us. Led by the thing wearing Kevin's face, they formed a semicircle between us and the only way out. In the faint light from the bones, I could see them more clearly now, and I wished I couldn't. They were wrong in ways that defied description. Human-shaped, but somehow more and less than human at the same time. Their limbs were too long, their joints bent at impossible angles, and their mouths were full of too many teeth, all sharp, all hungry. "Welcome to the heart of it all," the Kevin thing said, spreading its arms wide. "This is where it began, decades ago, where the first travelers made their bargain with the hunger, where the first sacrifices were made." "Sacrifices to what?" I demanded, backing closer to the bone circle. "To the thing that sleeps below," it said, gesturing toward the dark hole in the center of the circle. "The thing that has been here since before your species learned to walk upright. It dreams, and in its dreams, it hungers. And we are the instruments of its appetite." The hole in the center of the circle pulsed with a faint, sickly light. As I watched, something moved in the depths. Something vast and dark that I couldn't quite make out. But just seeing the edge of it was enough to make my sanity feel like it was unraveling at the edges. "You feel it, don't you?" the Kevin thing asked, seeing my reaction. "The weight of its attention, the magnitude of its hunger. It's been sleeping for so long, but it stirs now, stirs and hungers for fresh sustenance." The creatures began moving forward again, their impossible grins returning. I looked around desperately for some way out, some weapon I could use, but there was nothing except the bones. The bones were arranged in a perfect spiral around the hole, each one precisely placed. It was a ritual circle, a summoning circle, and if it could summon something, maybe it could banish it too. "Amanda, Sarah," I said quietly, "when I say run, scatter the bones. Break the circle." "What?" Amanda looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Michael, there are dozens of those things, and we have one dying torch." "Trust me," I said, and then louder, "You made a mistake bringing us here. This circle is your source of power, but it's also your weakness." The Kevin thing's grin faltered slightly. "You understand nothing, human. The circle is eternal. The hunger is eternal. You cannot break what has endured for millennia." "Maybe not," I said, "but I can sure as hell try." I threw my torch directly into the dark hole in the center of the circle. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The hole erupted with light, not the warm light of fire, but a cold, sickly radiance that turned everything the color of old bones. The creatures screamed, covering their eyes and stumbling backward, and from the depths of the hole came an answering scream, so loud and alien that it felt like it might tear my eardrums apart. "Now!" I shouted. The three of us scattered around the circle, kicking and throwing the carefully arranged bones into the forest. Each bone we displaced seemed to make the light from the hole flicker and dim. The creatures were writhing now, their forms becoming less stable, less human. "No!" the Kevin thing shrieked, its voice now completely inhuman. "You don't understand what you're doing. If the circle is broken, if the bindings fail, it will be free. Free to hunt beyond these woods, free to feed on the world." But I didn't care. Whatever was down in that hole, whatever had taken Kevin and God knew how many others, it had made one crucial mistake. It had gotten personal. It had used my friend's face, my friend's voice, my friend's memories against me, and now it was going to pay. Sarah kicked the last bone out of the circle, and the light from the hole began to pulse erratically. The creatures were falling apart now, their stolen human forms dissolving like smoke, but the Kevin thing held together longer than the others, its rage giving it strength. "You think you've won?" it snarled, lunging toward me with claws extended. "You think breaking the circle will save you? It will only make things worse, so much worse." I grabbed one of the larger bones from the ground and swung it like a club, catching the Kevin thing across the temple. It staggered, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw Kevin's real face underneath the mask of hunger and rage. His eyes were wide with terror and pain, but underneath that was something else: gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, and then the thing wearing his face collapsed, its form dissolving into shadow and mist. The hole in the center of the circle gave one final pulse of light and then went dark. The unnatural silence of the forest was replaced by normal night sounds. Owls hooting, insects chirping, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the air smelled different, cleaner somehow. We stood there for a long time, just breathing and trying to process what had happened. When I was finally sure the danger had passed, I helped Amanda and Sarah to their feet. "Is it over?" Sarah asked quietly. "I think so," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. "The circle's broken. The creatures are gone. Whatever was in that hole. I think we sent it back to sleep." We made our way back to the campsite slowly, expecting to find it destroyed or changed somehow. But everything was exactly as we'd left it. Except for one thing. Kevin's tent was back, set up perfectly in its original spot. Inside the tent, we found Kevin's body. He was lying in his sleeping bag, eyes closed, looking peaceful for the first time since this nightmare had begun. But he was cold, had been dead for hours. Whatever that thing had been wearing his face, it had been using his corpse as a template, a blueprint for its disguise. We buried him there in the forest, said what words we could over his grave. Then we packed up everything else and drove straight to the nearest town, where we told the police that Kevin had suffered some kind of accident while hiking alone. It wasn't true, but it was simpler than the truth. And sometimes simple lies are kinder than complex truths. That was 3 months ago. The nightmares are getting better, and Sarah's divorce finally went through. Amanda got a promotion at work. Life, as they say, goes on. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I find myself thinking about what the Kevin thing said before we broke the circle, about how destroying the bindings might have made things worse, not better, about how we might have freed something that was meant to stay contained. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I'm driving through a wooded area or walking past a park after dark, I catch a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. Something that walks like a human but moves all wrong. Something that watches me with eyes that reflect light like an animal's. I tell myself it's just my imagination, just residual trauma from what happened in the Pine Ridge. But deep down, I wonder if we really stopped anything that night, or if we just relocated it. The hunger, after all, is eternal, and now it's no longer confined to one small patch of Nebraska forest. Now it can go anywhere. Now it can hunt anywhere. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I think I can hear it calling my name. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Ruby Mountains of northeastern Nevada, about 40 miles south of Elko, in October of last year. I should have listened to the locals in Lamoille when they warned us about the area around Harrison Pass. The old man at the general store, weathered and suspicious, had shaken his head when David told him our planned route. "Folks go missing up there," he'd muttered, his gnarled fingers drumming against the counter. "Especially this time of year. Weather turns fast and there's other things." But we were 5 college friends on our annual camping trip, invincible in that particular way that comes from youth and ignorance. David Martinez, our self-appointed leader, had found the spot on some obscure hiking forum, a pristine alpine lake nestled between towering peaks, accessible only by a grueling 8-mile trek through dense wilderness. "It'll be epic," he'd promised, and we'd believed him. The group consisted of David, myself, Jennifer Williams, no relation despite the shared last name, Brian Wright, and Sarah Rodriguez. We'd been friends since freshman year at UNR, bonded by late-night study sessions and weekend adventures. This was supposed to be our last hurrah before real life scattered us to different cities and careers. The first sign something was wrong came 3 hours into our hike. Jennifer's GPS watch, a top-of-the-line model she'd bought specifically for this trip, began displaying impossible readings. According to the device, we were simultaneously at an elevation of 14,000 feet and 200 feet below sea level. The latitude and longitude coordinates flickered between numbers that would have placed us in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and somewhere in Canada. "Probably just satellite interference from the mountains," Brian said, though his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. He was our tech guy, the one who usually had explanations for glitches and malfunctions. The fact that he seemed genuinely puzzled made the rest of us uneasy. David consulted his paper map, a backup we'd all mocked him for bringing. But even that seemed wrong somehow. The trails we'd been following weren't marked, and the topography didn't match what we were seeing. According to the map, we should have been ascending gradually toward a ridge, but the ground beneath our feet was distinctly sloping downward. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," Sarah suggested, though we'd been meticulously following the trail markers for hours. The blazes on the trees were fresh, clearly maintained, leading us deeper into the wilderness with false confidence. The afternoon air was crisp and thin, carrying scents of pine and decomposing leaves. Every breath felt sharp in our lungs, and our shadows grew longer as the sun tracked westward across the sky. The silence between our conversations was filled with the normal sounds of wilderness: wind through branches, the distant cry of a hawk, our boots crunching on fallen leaves. But gradually I began to notice the absence of other sounds. No squirrels chittering in the trees, no insects buzzing. Even our own voices seemed muffled, as if the air itself was absorbing sound. "Hey," Jennifer said, stopping suddenly. "Does anyone else notice how quiet it is?" We all paused, listening. The silence was absolute, oppressive in a way that made my skin crawl. Even the wind had stopped. "Animals probably smell a storm coming," David said, but he kept glancing at the clear blue sky above us. We pressed on, though the wrongness of the place was becoming impossible to ignore. The trees seemed too uniform, their branches intertwined in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The shadows fell at odd angles, creating pools of darkness that seemed deeper than they should be. When we finally reached what David's forum post had described as the most beautiful alpine lake in Nevada, we found only a circular depression filled with black water that reflected nothing. The surface was perfectly still, like obsidian glass, and when David threw a stone into it, there was no splash, no ripples. The stone simply disappeared without a sound. "Okay, that's definitely not normal," Brian said, backing away from the water's edge. Sarah was setting up her camera, trying to capture the strange phenomenon when she noticed something else. "Guys," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Look at the timestamp." The camera's digital display showed a date 3 days in the future. "Must be a malfunction," Jennifer said, but she was checking her own devices. Her watch, her phone, even Brian's laptop, all showed different times, different dates, some in the past, some impossibly far in the future. David insisted we make camp anyway. "We've come this far," he argued. "And look, the weather's perfect. A little weirdness with the electronics isn't going to ruin our trip." But as we set up our tents around the edge of the dark lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sensation was constant, a crawling between my shoulder blades that made me want to keep turning around. Every time I did, though, there was nothing there except the unmoving trees and that terrible, silent water. Dinner was a subdued affair. Our camp stove refused to light properly, the flame burning a sickly green color that cast weird shadows on our faces. The food tasted metallic, and none of us had much appetite. We sat around our pathetic excuse for a fire, making forced conversation while the darkness pressed in around us. "I vote we head back first thing in the morning," Jennifer said. "This place gives me the creeps." Sarah nodded emphatically. "I've been getting this horrible feeling all day, like something's following us." "You're all being paranoid," David said, but even he sounded uncertain. "We just got here. Let's at least give it tonight." Brian was fiddling with his laptop trying to get a satellite connection. "This is impossible," he muttered. "According to GPS, we're not even on Earth anymore." As the temperature dropped with the setting sun, we retreated to our tents. I shared mine with Brian while David had his own, and the girls were together in the third tent. The plan was to get an early start in the morning and hike back to civilization. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps outside our tent. Not the heavy, clumsy steps of a bear or other large animal, but deliberate, measured footfalls that seemed almost human. Brian was snoring softly beside me, undisturbed, but something about the sound made every nerve in my body scream danger. Through the thin fabric of our tent, I could see a shadow moving past, tall and unnaturally thin. It paused directly outside our tent, and I held my breath, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it could be heard. The shadow stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, perfectly still. Then it moved on, and I heard the soft zip of a tent being opened. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped our tent as quietly as possible. David's tent was 20 feet away, and in the pale moonlight I could see a figure standing beside it. The figure was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for its body. It was looking down at David's tent with its head tilted at an impossible angle. "Hey!" I whispered harshly, but the figure didn't react. It simply melted back into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I crawled over to David's tent and listened. No sounds from inside, not even breathing. "David," I whispered. No response. With shaking hands, I unzipped his tent. Empty. His sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, and his boots were gone, but everything else was exactly as he'd left it. I woke the others, and we spent the next hour searching the area with our flashlights. We called David's name until our voices were hoarse, but the oppressive silence swallowed our cries without even an echo. There were no tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate where he might have gone. "We need to hike out and get help," Jennifer said, her voice shaking. "Something's really wrong here." But Sarah was staring out at the dark water. "Look," she whispered. There was something floating in the center of the lake, something that looked like a person, face down, arms and legs spread wide. We couldn't tell if it was David, couldn't even tell if it was really human from this distance, but it was there, bobbing gently on the surface that had been perfectly still hours before. "We have to get him," Brian said, starting toward the water's edge. "No," I grabbed his arm. "Something's not right about this. David wouldn't just wander off like that, and how did he end up in the middle of the lake?" We stood there arguing about what to do when we heard footsteps behind us. Slow, deliberate steps coming from the direction of our camp. We turned, and there was David, walking toward us with a strange, measured gait. He was fully dressed, including his boots, and he was smiling. Not the easy, familiar smile we all knew, but something wider, showing too many teeth. "Where were you?" Sarah demanded. "We've been looking everywhere." David didn't answer immediately. He just kept walking toward us with that wrong smile, his eyes reflecting the moonlight like an animal's. When he was about 10 feet away, he stopped. "I was walking," he said finally. His voice was David's voice, but the rhythm was off, the words spaced too far apart. "I found something interesting." "What did you find?" Brian asked, though I could hear the fear in his voice. David's smile widened impossibly. "I found what was looking for us." The thing floating in the lake was gone. We backed away from David, or whatever was wearing David's face, but it didn't follow. It just stood there, swaying slightly, watching us with those reflecting eyes. "We need to leave," Jennifer whispered. "Right now." We grabbed what we could carry and started down the trail, leaving most of our gear behind. The thing that looked like David watched us go, its smile never wavering, until we were swallowed by the darkness of the forest. The hike down was a nightmare. Our flashlights flickered and dimmed despite fresh batteries. The trail seemed to shift beneath our feet, sometimes leading us in circles, sometimes disappearing entirely. Several times we had to backtrack when we found ourselves facing sheer cliff walls that hadn't been there before. And always, we could hear footsteps behind us. Never close enough to see their source, but constant, matching our pace exactly. When we stopped, they stopped. When we ran, they ran. It was Brian who noticed that Jennifer was acting strange. She'd been bringing up the rear, and when he looked back to check on her, she was walking with the same measured gait David had displayed, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Jennifer?" he called softly. She turned toward him, and in the pale light of his flashlight we could see that her eyes were reflecting like mirrors. When she smiled, it was that same too-wide grin. "I found something interesting," she said in Jennifer's voice, but with the wrong rhythm. Sarah screamed. We ran then, crashing through the underbrush, abandoning the trail entirely. Branches tore at our clothes and faces, and roots seemed to reach up to trip us, but we didn't stop. Behind us, we could hear them, both of them, following at that same deliberate pace. They didn't seem to be in any hurry. They knew these woods better than we did now. When Sarah collapsed from exhaustion, we had to make a choice. Brian was all for leaving her, his panic overriding loyalty, but I couldn't abandon her. We helped her to her feet and kept moving, though our pace was much slower now. That's when we heard Jennifer's voice calling to us from somewhere in the darkness ahead. "Guys, over here! I found the trail!" But Jennifer was behind us, following with that wrong smile. I could hear her footsteps keeping pace with our stumbling flight. Sarah began to sob. "There's more than one of them," she whispered. "They're all around us." She was right. As we struggled through the forest, we began to hear other voices calling to us. David's voice from the left promising he'd found the way out. Brian's voice from the right, though Brian was standing right beside me, his face pale with terror. Even my own voice echoing from somewhere ahead, calling back to myself. The voices were patient, persistent. They never got angry when we didn't respond, never seemed frustrated by our refusal to trust them. They just kept calling, offering help, promising safety, using our own voices against us. Dawn came like a revelation, the first gray light filtering through the canopy above. In the growing daylight, the voices faded, though we could still hear the footsteps. Always the footsteps. We'd been walking for hours when we finally stumbled onto a service road, a real road, with tire tracks and power lines. Sarah collapsed to her knees and kissed the asphalt. It took us another 2 hours to flag down a vehicle, a Forest Service truck with a bewildered ranger who couldn't understand how we had ended up so far from where we claimed to have been camping. "Ruby Lake," he said, consulting his map. "That's 40 miles from here. How did you walk 40 miles in one night?" We tried to explain, but how do you tell someone that their map is wrong, that the forest rearranged itself around us, that our friends had been replaced by something wearing their faces? He chalked it up to hypothermia and panic, drove us to the nearest hospital for observation. They kept us for 2 days. The doctors found nothing physically wrong with us, though Brian had developed a severe stutter and Sarah wouldn't stop looking over her shoulder. They prescribed anxiety medication and referred us to counselors. The police searched for David and Jennifer. They found our abandoned campsite exactly where it should have been according to the map, not near any lake but in a small clearing beside a seasonal stream. Our tents were still set up, exactly as we'd left them, but David and Jennifer's gear was gone. Not just their personal items, but their sleeping bags, their packs, even their tent stakes, as if they'd never been there at all. The search lasted 3 weeks. They brought in dogs, helicopters, experienced trackers. They found no trace of our friends, no footprints, no fabric caught on branches, nothing. The dogs refused to go beyond a certain point on the trail, whining and backing away from something only they could smell. Eventually, they declared David and Jennifer missing persons, presumed dead. There was talk of exposure, of accidents, of the 1,000 ways people can die in the wilderness. Their families held memorial services. Brian and Sarah and I attended, sitting in the back, sharing looks that confirmed we all knew the truth. David and Jennifer weren't dead. They were something else now. The nightmares started a month later. I dream of walking through an endless forest, hearing familiar voices calling to me from the darkness. Sometimes in these dreams, I'd catch glimpses of David and Jennifer between the trees, still wearing those impossible smiles, still walking with that measured gait. But the worst part of the dreams wasn't seeing them. It was the growing certainty that I was starting to walk the same way. 3 months after our return, Brian hanged himself in his apartment. The note he left was just one line. I can hear them calling. Sarah moved back in with her parents and refused to talk about what happened. When I called to check on her, her mother told me Sarah spent most of her time standing at the window, watching the street with a peculiar intensity. "She keeps saying someone's coming to visit," her mother said, "but when I ask who, she just smiles and won't answer." I knew that smile. I started researching the area where we'd camped, digging through historical records and local folklore. The Ruby Mountains had a history of disappearances going back to the Shoshone tribes who'd avoided certain areas, calling them places where the land eats people. Early settlers reported similar incidents, entire families vanishing without a trace, leaving behind abandoned homesteads with no signs of struggle. In 1952, a group of geology students from the University of Nevada had gone missing in the same general area. Their professor found their camp the next day, abandoned but undisturbed. 3 of the 5 students were never found. The other 2 were discovered 6 months later, wandering naked through downtown Elko, unable to remember what had happened to them. They spent the rest of their lives in psychiatric facilities, babbling about walking trees and faces in the water. The more I researched, the more I understood that we'd stumbled into something old, something that had been feeding on human beings for longer than recorded history. The Shoshone had words for it, descriptions of entities that could wear human faces, that could mimic voices and movements perfectly but couldn't quite get the timing right. Skinwalkers, they called them, though that wasn't quite accurate. These things weren't human witches transformed into animals. They were something else entirely, something that existed in the spaces between reality, feeding on human essence and growing stronger with each feeding. I moved to Las Vegas, thinking distance would help. For a while, it seemed to work. The dreams became less frequent, and I could go days without hearing phantom footsteps behind me. I got a job, made new friends, tried to rebuild a normal life. But they were patient. They'd waited for us for centuries, and they could wait a little longer. It was 6 months after Brian's death when I saw David again. I was walking home from work, cutting through a parking garage, when I glimpsed a familiar figure standing by one of the concrete pillars. He was wearing the same clothes he'd had on the night he disappeared, and he was smiling that wrong smile. "Hello, Michael," he said in David's voice. "I've been looking for you." I ran. I ran harder than I had in the mountains, my dress shoes slipping on the concrete, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Behind me, I could hear those measured footsteps, unhurried but relentless. I made it to my apartment and triple-locked the door, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They'd found me once, they'd find me again. That night I heard Jennifer's voice calling to me from the hallway outside my apartment. "Michael, are you in there? We need to talk." I didn't answer, but I looked through the peephole. Jennifer was standing in the hallway, still wearing the hiking clothes from our trip. She looked exactly as she had that night, except for the smile. Always that smile. "I know you're in there," she said, though I hadn't made a sound. "We just want to talk. We have so much to tell you about what we found." They stayed in the hallway for 3 days. I could see them through the peephole taking turns, sometimes standing together, sometimes alone. They never seemed to need food or rest. They just waited with that infinite patience, knowing I'd have to come out eventually. On the 4th day, they were gone. But I knew they'd be back. I'm writing this account as a warning to anyone who might read it. The Ruby Mountains of Nevada contain something ancient and hungry, something that wears human faces and speaks with human voices but isn't human at all. Don't go there alone. Don't go there in groups. Don't go there at all. If you do go, and you see things that don't make sense, electronics malfunctioning, maps that don't match the terrain, silence where there should be wildlife, turn around immediately. Don't make camp. Don't investigate. Just leave. And if someone in your group disappears and comes back acting strange, if they walk differently or smile too much or use the wrong rhythm when they speak, run. Don't try to help them. Don't try to understand what happened. Just run and don't look back, because they're not your friend anymore. There's something else wearing your friend's face and they want you to join them. I've been living in my apartment for 3 weeks now, afraid to go outside, afraid to answer the door. But I can hear them calling to me at night, using voices I recognize. Sarah called yesterday, asking me to come visit. Brian calls every evening, insisting he's not really dead. My mother called this morning. She's been dead for 10 years. They're all out there in the hallway waiting for me to open the door. I can see their shadows underneath the gap, and sometimes I hear that measured footstep pacing back and forth. But the worst part is that I'm starting to want to open the door. I'm starting to think that maybe they're right, that maybe what they found in those mountains isn't so bad after all. The voices are so familiar, so comforting, and they promise such interesting things. I can feel myself beginning to smile as I write this. It feels good to smile this wide, to let my face stretch into new configurations. They're calling my name now, all of them together, and their voices are harmonizing in ways human voices shouldn't be able to harmonize. I think I'm going to answer the door. I think I want to see what they found. After all, it must be something very interesting indeed. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Jarbidge Wilderness of northern Nevada in October of last year. I've told this story to exactly 3 people: my therapist, my sister, and now you. Each time I tell it, I hope the telling will make it feel less real, but it never does. The memories remain as sharp and terrible as broken glass. I went to Jarbidge to disappear for a while. My divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, and I'd been struggling to find solid ground ever since. My ex-wife had taken the house, the savings, and most of our mutual friends. What she couldn't take was my dog, Ranger, a 5-year-old German Shepherd mix who'd been my constant companion since he was 8 weeks old. He was all I had left that still looked at me like I mattered. The plan was simple: 2 weeks of solitude in one of Nevada's most remote wilderness areas. I'd done plenty of camping before, though never completely alone except for Ranger. I loaded my Jeep with supplies, camping gear, and enough food for both of us to last 3 weeks if necessary. The drive from Reno took nearly 6 hours, winding through increasingly desolate landscape until I reached the tiny settlement of Jarbidge. Population maybe 50 on a good day. I parked at the wilderness trailhead just outside town, where a weathered sign warned hikers about mountain lions, bears, and flash floods. What it didn't mention were the other dangers that lurked in these ancient mountains. I should have paid attention to how quiet it was. No bird songs, no insect buzz, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Ranger was restless from the long drive, whining and pacing circles around the Jeep as I loaded my pack. He kept looking toward the tree line with his ears pricked forward, tail held stiff. I figured he was just picking up the scent of wildlife. These mountains were full of deer, elk, and smaller game that would naturally make a dog excited. "Easy, boy," I said, clipping his leash to my belt. "We've got miles to go before we set up camp." The trail began easy enough, a well-worn path that followed Jarbidge Creek upstream into the heart of the wilderness. My plan was to hike about 8 miles to a remote valley I'd marked on my topographical map, far enough from the main trails to ensure complete solitude. The creek gurgled pleasantly beside us, and gradually the sound began to drown out the unnatural silence that had bothered me at the trailhead. For the first few hours, everything felt normal. The October air was crisp but not cold, perfect for hiking with a heavy pack. Ranger settled into his usual trail rhythm, staying close to my left side, occasionally darting ahead to investigate interesting scents before returning. The aspens were turning golden, creating a spectacular display against the dark green of the pine and fir trees that covered the higher slopes. But as we climbed deeper into the wilderness, things began to feel off. It started with small things I tried to dismiss. The trail markers seemed wrong. I'd studied the map extensively, but the distances between numbered posts didn't match what I expected. My GPS kept giving me inconsistent readings, showing our elevation fluctuating wildly even on level ground. I blamed it on the thick canopy and remote location interfering with satellite reception. Then there were the sounds, or rather the lack of them. As we hiked higher, the natural sounds of the forest gradually faded until we were moving through a bubble of absolute silence. No wind in the trees, no scurrying of small animals, no distant bird calls. Just the sound of our breathing, our footsteps, and the soft jingle of Ranger's collar tags. Ranger's behavior grew increasingly strange as the day wore on. He would stop suddenly and stare into the forest, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his throat. When I looked in the direction of his gaze, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. After several minutes of this, he would shake himself as if coming out of a trance and continue walking, but his easy trail demeanor was gone. He stayed pressed against my leg, constantly looking over his shoulder. "What's got you spooked, buddy?" I asked him during one of our rest stops. He looked up at me with eyes that seemed almost human in their intensity, as if he was trying to communicate something urgent. But dogs can't talk, and I was probably just projecting my own unease onto him. We reached my intended campsite, a small meadow beside the creek surrounded by towering pines, just as the sun was beginning to sink behind the western ridges. It was exactly as I'd pictured it from studying the topographical map: isolated, beautiful, and peaceful. The creek formed a small pool at one edge of the meadow, perfect for water and washing. I should have felt relieved and happy. Instead, I felt like we were being watched. Setting up camp became an exercise in controlled paranoia. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I pitched my tent, convinced I was seeing movement in my peripheral vision. But every time I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Ranger refused to leave my side, even when I tried to send him to investigate the interesting smells that should have been irresistible to a curious dog. As darkness fell, my unease crystallized into genuine fear. I've never been afraid of the dark. In fact, some of my best camping memories involve lying in my sleeping bag and watching the stars through the tent mesh. But this darkness felt different. It didn't just block the light, it seemed to absorb it, creating a blackness so complete that I couldn't see my hand in front of my face once I turned off my headlamp. The silence that had bothered me during the day became something far worse at night. It was so absolute that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on us like a suffocating blanket. I strained my ears, desperate to hear something, anything, that would indicate we weren't alone in a dead world. Even the creek seemed to have stopped flowing, though I knew that was impossible. I built a large fire using far more wood than necessary, feeding it constantly to keep the flames high and bright. Ranger lay pressed against my leg, trembling slightly. Every few minutes he would lift his head and stare into the darkness beyond the firelight, ears forward, body tense. But he never barked, never made any sound at all. It was as if he knew that drawing attention to our presence would be a fatal mistake. Around midnight, things got worse. I was feeding another log to the fire when Ranger suddenly leaped to his feet, every muscle in his body rigid. His lips pulled back in a silent snarl, and the fur along his spine stood up in a ridge. He was staring at something in the tree line across the meadow, about 40 yards away. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it where he was looking. The beam revealed nothing but trees and undergrowth, but I kept it trained on the spot anyway. For several minutes, we stayed frozen in tableau. Me holding the light, Ranger poised to either attack or flee. Then I saw them. Eyes. At first, just one pair, reflecting the light with an unnatural amber glow. They were positioned too high to belong to any normal animal, at least 8 feet off the ground. As I watched, paralyzed with terror, more pairs appeared. 3, then 5, then too many to count, all at the same impossible height, all fixed on our campsite. I wanted to run, every instinct screaming at me to grab Ranger and flee into the night, but some deeper survival sense kept me frozen in place. These were predators' eyes, and running would trigger a chase response that would end with us being hunted down in the darkness. "Easy, Ranger," I whispered, barely able to force the words past the terror that was closing my throat. "Stay calm, boy." The eyes watched us for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished. Not one by one, but all at once, as if they had been a shared hallucination that simply ended. Ranger remained tense for another few minutes, then gradually relaxed and lay back down. But he kept his head up and his ears pricked, maintaining his vigil. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the fire, feeding it log after log, and watched the tree line for any sign of movement. When dawn finally came, I nearly cried with relief. The gray light revealed a normal forest meadow with no sign that anything unusual had happened. I walked the perimeter of our campsite, looking for tracks or other evidence of nocturnal visitors, but found nothing. The ground showed only my own footprints and Ranger's paw prints. I should have packed up and left immediately. Every rational part of my mind was screaming that we were in danger, that whatever had watched us from the forest was not something I wanted to encounter again. But I'd planned a 2-week trip. I'd driven 6 hours to get here, and I was damned if I was going to be run off by what might have been nothing more than nocturnal animals and an overactive imagination. It was the stupidest decision of my life. The second day started normally enough. Ranger seemed to have recovered from his nighttime anxiety, though he remained more clingy than usual. I decided to explore the area around our campsite, maybe do some fishing in the creek. I left most of our gear in the tent and set off with just a day pack, planning to stay within a mile or two of camp. That's when I discovered that the landscape itself was wrong. According to my map, there should have been a prominent ridge about half a mile north of our campsite. When I climbed to where it should have been, I found a deep ravine instead. The creek that ran past our camp supposedly flowed east toward the Jarbidge River, but when I followed it, it led west toward a series of small lakes that weren't marked on any of my maps. I tried to use my GPS to figure out where we actually were, but the device had stopped working entirely. The screen showed only static, and resetting it didn't help. My cell phone had no signal, which was expected in this remote area, but the compass app was spinning wildly and couldn't lock onto magnetic north. "We're lost, aren't we, boy?" I said to Ranger, trying to keep my voice light and casual. He looked up at me with those intelligent brown eyes, and I swear I could see concern in them. By the time we made it back to camp, I was genuinely worried. Not panicked yet, but worried. I had enough food and water for many days, and eventually I could simply follow the creek downstream until I reached civilization. But the fact that the terrain didn't match my maps was deeply unsettling. I'd been reading topographical maps since I was a Boy Scout, and I'd never been wrong about major features like ridges and watercourses. The second night was worse than the first. The eyes returned, but this time they weren't content to simply watch from the tree line. I first became aware of them around 10 o'clock, when Ranger again went rigid with that silent snarl. But when I aimed my flashlight across the meadow, the eyes were closer, maybe 20 yards away instead of 40. Over the next hour, they continued to advance. Each time I checked, they had moved closer to our campsite, always maintaining that perfect circle around us, always staying just at the edge of my flashlight beam. By midnight, they were perhaps 10 yards away, close enough that I could make out vague shapes behind them. Tall, thin forms that might have been human if humans could stand 9 feet tall and move without making any sound. I was no longer sitting casually by the fire. I was crouched in a defensive position with Ranger pressed against my back, both of us facing outward, trying to keep watch in all directions at once. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. Every few seconds I would sweep the beam around our perimeter, and every time I did, the eyes were a little closer. Then one of them spoke. "Kenneth," it said, and its voice was exactly like mine. Not similar, identical. The same tone, the same inflection, even the same slight rasp from years of smoking that I'd finally quit. "Kenneth, why don't you come here?" I nearly screamed. Ranger did make a sound then, a high, thin whine like a dog in pain. "Kenneth," the voice said again, and this time it was coming from a different direction. "I'm lost, Kenneth. I need help." Then a third voice, also mine, from behind us. "Ranger. Here, boy. Come here, Ranger." That last one was too much. Ranger bolted toward the sound of his name being called in my voice, disappearing into the darkness before I could grab his collar. "Ranger!" I screamed. Come back!" There was no answer, no sound of paws on grass, no jingling of collar tags, nothing. My dog had vanished into the night as completely as if he had never existed. I spent the rest of that night in a state beyond terror. I sat with my back against a large pine tree at the edge of our campsite, flashlight in one hand and my largest knife in the other, waiting for whatever was out there to finally come for me. The voices continued throughout the night, sometimes calling my name, sometimes calling for Ranger, sometimes just making conversation in my own voice as if I was talking to myself. The worst was when they started recounting memories, things only I should know. They talked about my wedding day, about the fight that ended my marriage, about the way Ranger looked as a puppy. They knew details that no one else could possibly know, speaking them in my voice with perfect accuracy. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the first gray light began to filter through the trees, the voices stopped abruptly. I waited until full daylight before I dared to move away from my tree. Ranger was gone. I spent hours calling for him, searching the surrounding forest, following what might have been paw prints but could just as easily have been marks made by small rocks or fallen branches. There was no sign of him anywhere. By mid-morning, I knew I had to make a choice. Continue searching for my dog or get the hell out of these mountains while I still could. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but I chose survival. I packed up my gear and started hiking back toward the trailhead, leaving most of my food scattered around the campsite in case Ranger somehow found his way back. That's when I discovered that leaving wasn't going to be simple. The trail that had brought us to this campsite was gone. Not overgrown or hard to follow, completely gone. Where there had been a clear path marked with trail blazes, there was now unbroken forest. I hiked in every direction from our campsite, following the creek both upstream and downstream, but I couldn't find any trace of the trail we'd used to get here. I tried to navigate by compass, but my compass was as useless as the GPS had been. The needle spun freely, never settling on any direction. Even the sun seemed wrong. It appeared to be rising in the north and setting in the south, which was impossible but undeniable. For 3 days, I wandered through a forest that seemed designed to confuse me. Landmarks I'd passed in the morning would be gone when I tried to retrace my steps in the afternoon. Streams flowed uphill. Trees grew in patterns that hurt to look at directly. And always, there was the feeling of being watched. On the 4th morning, I woke up to find that most of my remaining food had rotted overnight. Not just spoiled, rotted into black, stinking mush that crawled with maggots. My water had turned brackish and undrinkable. Even my sealed energy bars had somehow become moldy and inedible. I was being starved out. That evening, as I sat beside my pitiful fire trying to decide whether eating the suspicious-looking berries I'd found was worth the risk of poisoning, I heard a familiar sound. Jingling collar tags. "Ranger," I called softly, hardly daring to hope. He emerged from the tree line slowly, and at first I was so happy to see him that I didn't notice anything wrong. I ran toward him, calling his name, ready to hug him and cry with relief. But something in his posture made me stop when I was still about 10 feet away. He was standing too still, too perfectly balanced. His tail wasn't wagging. His mouth was slightly open, but he wasn't panting. And his eyes were wrong. They were the right color, the right shape, but they held an intelligence that was definitely not canine. They looked at me with calculation, evaluation, hunger. "Ranger," I said again, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. The thing that looked like my dog tilted its head in a way that Ranger had never done, too far to one side, at an angle that would have been uncomfortable for any real animal. When it opened its mouth, human words came out in my own voice. "I've been looking for you, Kenneth," it said. "I was so worried." I ran. I crashed through the underbrush in blind panic, not caring about direction or destination, just trying to put distance between myself and the abomination that wore my dog's face. Branches tore at my clothes and scratched my skin. I fell several times, rolling down slopes and crashing into trees, but I kept running. Behind me, I could hear it following. Not running. It didn't need to run. It moved through the forest with unnatural grace, somehow keeping pace with my panicked flight while barely seeming to exert effort. Occasionally, I would hear it call to me in my own voice, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes laughing with a sound like breaking glass. I ran until my lungs felt like they were on fire and my legs would no longer support me. When I finally collapsed beside a fallen log, gasping and shaking, the thing that looked like Ranger emerged from the trees about 20 yards away. It had changed. The proportions were still roughly dog-like, but the limbs were too long now, the neck stretched to an impossible length. Its fur had taken on a grayish, mottled appearance, and when it moved, it was with the fluid gait of something that had too many joints. "Why are you running from me, Kenneth?" it asked in my voice. "Don't you love me anymore?" That's when I finally understood what I was dealing with. I'd heard stories about them growing up in Nevada, creatures from Shoshone and Paiute legends that could wear the shapes of animals and people, skinwalkers, Naldlushi, things that should have stayed in the realm of campfire stories and urban legends. But understanding what it was didn't help me figure out how to fight it. The creature circled me slowly, maintaining its distance but clearly in no hurry. I was exhausted, lost, hungry, and completely at its mercy. It knew I had nowhere left to run. "I missed you while I was gone," it continued in my voice. "I've learned so many interesting things about you. Did you know that your ex-wife is dating someone new? A lawyer named Marcus. They seem very happy together." The casual cruelty of using my own voice to tell me something I'd been trying not to think about was devastating. But it also made me angry, and anger was better than fear. Anger I could use. "You're not Ranger," I said, forcing my voice to sound steady. "I don't know what you are, but you're not my dog." The thing wearing Ranger's shape laughed with my voice, but the sound was wrong. Too many harmonics, like multiple people laughing at slightly different pitches. "Of course I'm not your dog," it said. "Your dog is dead. I ate him on the first night while you slept. He was delicious." The rage that hit me was white-hot and complete. I'd lost everything: my marriage, my house, my savings, my sense of purpose. But Ranger had been the one constant in my life, the one thing that loved me unconditionally. The idea that this thing had killed him and was now wearing his form like a costume was unbearable. I lunged at it with my knife. The creature moved faster than anything had a right to move, flowing backward like liquid shadow. But it wasn't quite fast enough. The blade caught it across what would have been Ranger's shoulder, opening a gash that leaked black fluid instead of blood. It screamed, not with my voice this time, but with a sound like tearing metal that made my teeth ache. The scream went on far longer than any living thing could have sustained it, echoing off the mountains until it seemed like the entire forest was shrieking. When the sound finally died away, the creature was no longer even pretending to be a dog. It stood on two legs now, roughly humanoid but wrong in every detail. Its limbs were too long, its fingers ended in black claws, and its face was a shifting blur that couldn't decide what shape it wanted to be. "You shouldn't have done that," it said, and now its voice was a chorus of different tones: male, female, child, elderly, all speaking in perfect unison. "Now I'm going to have to hurt you." What followed was a nightmare chase through a forest that seemed to rearrange itself as we moved through it. The creature was faster than me, stronger than me, and knew the terrain in ways that were impossible. But it was also wounded, and apparently my knife had done more damage than the small cut suggested. Black fluid leaked from the wound, and occasionally the creature would stumble or pause as if in pain. I had no plan beyond running and staying alive for as long as possible. The chase went on for what felt like hours, though the sun never seemed to move in the sky. I scrambled up slopes and slid down ravines, crashed through streams, and fought my way through tangles of undergrowth. Behind me, the creature followed with inexorable patience, sometimes visible, sometimes just a sense of malevolent presence tracking my every move. Eventually, I reached a place where the chase had to end. I found myself on a narrow ledge overlooking a deep canyon, with nowhere left to run. The creature emerged from the trees below and began climbing toward me with spider-like grace, ascending the sheer rock face as easily as walking on level ground. I was finished, and I knew it. But I still had the knife, and I was determined to make my death cost this thing as much as possible. When it reached the ledge, I was waiting. We fought with a violence that was purely animal, all technique forgotten in favor of survival instinct. The creature was stronger, but it seemed unused to prey that fought back effectively. I managed to open several more wounds with my knife, each one leaking that strange black fluid. But it was a losing battle. Gradually, inevitably, the creature overwhelmed me. Its claws raked across my chest and arms, opening deep gashes that burned like acid. When it finally had me pinned to the rock, one hand around my throat, I thought my story was over. Instead, it paused. "You're brave," it said in a voice I didn't recognize, neither mine nor the discordant chorus from before. This voice was older, tired, almost sad. "Braver than most. I think I'll keep you for a while instead of eating you immediately." That's when I made my last desperate gamble. I still had one trick left, something the creature apparently didn't know about. While we'd been fighting, I'd managed to work my other hand into my pocket where I kept a small emergency flare, the kind used by pilots and boaters as a distress signal. I pulled the pin and jammed the flare directly into the creature's wound. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The creature released me and staggered backward, shrieking in that metal-tearing voice as brilliant red light erupted from the gash. The light seemed to cause it physical pain, and where the chemical fire touched its flesh, the black skin began to bubble and smoke. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I rolled away from the edge, got to my feet, and ran. This time, the creature didn't follow. Its screams echoed through the canyon for several minutes, gradually growing more distant, and then there was silence. I kept running anyway, crashing through the forest in a panic. I had no idea where I was going, but anywhere was better than that ledge. I ran until I could run no more, then walked until I couldn't walk, then crawled until exhaustion finally claimed me. When I woke up, I was lying beside a paved road. Not a trail, not a dirt track, an actual asphalt road with yellow center lines and everything. I could see the Jarbidge settlement about a mile in the distance. Somehow, impossibly, I had found my way out of the wilderness. I never found my Jeep. When I reached town and asked about it, nobody remembered seeing me arrive. According to them, no one had used the wilderness trailhead in over a month. My vehicle was simply gone, as if it had never existed. The local sheriff was kind enough to drive me to Elko, where I could catch a bus back to Reno. He asked what had happened to me. I was scratched, exhausted, and probably looked like I'd been through hell. I told him I'd gotten lost hiking and had to bushwhack my way out. He seemed to accept this explanation, though he did mention that several hikers had gone missing in the Jarbidge area over the years. I never reported Ranger missing. How could I explain that my dog had been killed and replaced by something that wore his shape? Instead, I simply grieved for him quietly, the way you grieve for someone whose body you'll never find. The scratches the creature gave me healed, but they left scars that are still visible today. They're not normal scars. They have an odd, silvery appearance and they sometimes ache on cold nights. When people ask about them, I say they're from a rock climbing accident. I've never been camping since then. I live in the city now, in a high-rise apartment with good locks and bright lights. I keep my curtains closed after dark, and I've never owned another dog. Sometimes I think about getting one. A companion, a friend, something to love that might love me back. But then, I remember Ranger's face in those final moments, wearing an intelligence that wasn't his own, and I lose my nerve. The worst part isn't the fear, or the nightmares, or even the loss of my best friend. The worst part is the doubt. Because sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed listening to the city sounds outside my window, I wonder if any of it really happened. Maybe I just had a psychotic break in the wilderness. Maybe I got lost and dehydrated, and my mind created an elaborate delusion to explain the trauma. Maybe Ranger just ran off and got lost, the way dogs sometimes do, and I invented a monster to blame for losing him. But then I look at the scars on my arms, silvery and strange, and I remember the sound of that thing speaking in my own voice. And I know that whatever happened in those mountains was real. I'm telling you this story because I need someone else to know. The therapists don't believe me. They're very polite about it, but I can see the skepticism in their eyes. They think it's a metaphor for grief or guilt or post-traumatic stress. My sister believes me, or at least she says she does, but sometimes I catch her looking at me with concern, as if she's worried about my mental state. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am crazy. But if you ever find yourself camping alone in the Nevada wilderness and you hear your own voice calling to you from the darkness, don't answer. Don't investigate. Pack up your gear and leave immediately, no matter how foolish it makes you feel. Because some things in this world are older and hungrier than human understanding, and they're always looking for new shapes to wear. The scars on my arms are burning as I write this. They always burn when I tell this story, as if the creature that made them is somehow aware that I'm sharing its secret. Sometimes I think it's still out there, still wearing faces it has stolen, still hunting for people foolish enough to venture into its territory alone. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I don't think I am. If you're ever driving through northern Nevada and you see a sign for Jarbidge, keep driving. There's nothing there worth the risk. Trust me on this one. I've paid the price for learning it the hard way, and that price was higher than I ever imagined possible. The wilderness there isn't empty. It's full of things that hunger for what we are, and they're very good at taking it.